My name is Alex, and I grew up in a small, quiet town nestled deep in the heart of the countryside. As a child, I spent countless summer days at my grandmother's old, creaky farmhouse. It was a place filled with memories, laughter, and the comforting smell of freshly baked bread. But as the years went by, the once warm and inviting house began to feel different, almost sinister. Grandmother lived alone after Grandpa passed away, and though she aged gracefully, there was something about her that seemed to change with each passing year. Her once warm smile turned into a vacant stare, and her gentle voice grew raspy and cold. I shrugged it off as part of getting old, until one night, I realized there was something far more unsettling at play. I had decided to spend the weekend with grandmother, helping her around the house. It was a chilly autumn evening when I arrived, the wind howling through the trees, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Grandmother greeted me at the door, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "Come in, Alex," she whispered, her voice sending a shiver down my spine. "I've been waiting for you." I entered the house, the familiar smell of herbs and old wood enveloping me. The house was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. As we sat down for dinner, I couldn't help but notice the strange, almost hypnotic way grandmother moved and spoke. Her eyes, once full of life, now seemed hollow and distant. After dinner, I helped grandmother upstairs to her room. The second floor of the farmhouse was even darker and colder, with only a few flickering candles to light the way. As I tucked her into bed, she grasped my hand with surprising strength. "Alex," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Her grip tightened, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "This house. It's not what it seems. There's something here, something that has been with our family for generations. It's a curse, Alex. A dark presence that feeds on our souls." I tried to reassure her, but the look in her eyes told me she was serious. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, the creaks and groans of the old house echoing through the silence. As the clock struck midnight, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Alex." My heart pounded in my chest as I got up and followed the voice. It led me to the attic, a place I had always avoided. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the cold air sent a chill down my spine. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the full moon shining through a small window. In the corner of the attic, I saw it, a figure, hunched over, its back turned to me. It was grandmother. She was muttering something under her breath, a language I didn't understand. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. As I stepped closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Grandmother?" I whispered. She turned to face me, and I saw her eyes, black as coal, void of any humanity. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and she began to laugh, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. "You can't escape it, Alex," she hissed. "The curse is in our blood. It will consume you, just as it consumed me." I stumbled back, tripping over an old trunk. As I scrambled to my feet, the figure of my grandmother lunged at me, her hands clawing at the air. I ran, tearing down the stairs and out of the house, the sound of her laughter following me into the night. I never returned to that farmhouse. The memories of that night haunt me to this day. I still hear her voice sometimes, in my dreams, reminding me that the darkness is always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim another soul.
My name is James, and I want to share a story about my dog, Max, and how he saved me one night. Max is a loyal German Shepherd, and we've been inseparable since he was a puppy. We have a routine of taking a walk every evening, and that night was no different, or so I thought. It was a clear evening, with a light breeze in the air, as Max and I walked down our usual path near the old cemetery. The moon was bright, and everything seemed peaceful. But Max, usually full of energy and curiosity, was acting differently. He was alert, his ears standing straight up, and he let out a low, unusual growl. "What's up, Max?" I asked, feeling a bit uneasy. Max tugged on his leash, pulling me toward the cemetery gates. I hesitated, but his insistence made me follow. As we walked through the gates, Max's growl turned into a bark. He was clearly trying to warn me about something. I looked around, trying to see what had caught his attention. That's when I noticed a man standing by one of the tombstones, staring at us. He looked lost and confused, and something about him didn't feel right. Max stood between me and the man, barking loudly. "Hello? Do you need help?" I called out, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he started walking toward us, his movements slow and unsteady. Max barked even louder, and I could feel my heart racing. Just as the man got closer, Max lunged forward, pulling me back and breaking my concentration. The man stopped, seemingly startled by Max's aggression. He turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Max had sensed something was wrong before I did, and he had protected me. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me as I patted Max on the head. "Good boy, Max. Let's go home." As we walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Max had saved me from something dangerous that night. Since then, I've trusted Max's instincts even more. He's more than just a pet. He's my protector. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to visit the cemetery during the day. I found the tombstone where the man had been standing. It was old and weathered, with a name I didn't recognize. I asked around the neighborhood and learned that the man buried there had died under mysterious circumstances many years ago. Some said his spirits still wandered the cemetery at night. The story sent a shiver down my spine, but it made me appreciate Max even more. That night, he had sensed something beyond my understanding and kept me safe. Max continues to be my loyal companion, always looking out for me. We still take our evening walks, but I steer clear of the cemetery. Max seems more relaxed now, and I trust his instincts implicitly. He's not just my dog, he's my guardian, always watching over me. And so every night as I look at Max curled up by my side, I'm reminded of how he protected me. It's a bond that's grown even stronger, built on trust and a shared experience that neither of us will ever forget.
My name is Mark, and I want to tell you about an experience I had on Mount Everest that changed my life forever. As an avid mountaineer, I've always been drawn to the allure of Everest, the highest peak in the world. Little did I know that my last expedition would take a turn that I could never have anticipated. We started our climb early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The air was crisp and thin, each breath a reminder of the altitude we were facing. Our team consisted of experienced climbers, each of us determined to reach the summit. We made our way through the Khumbu icefall, navigating the treacherous crevasses and towering seracs. As we ascended higher, the weather began to change. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up, howling through the mountains like a haunting wail. We decided to set up camp for the night, hoping the storm would pass by morning. The temperature dropped significantly, and we huddled together in our tents, trying to stay warm. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The howling wind outside sounded almost like voices, whispering unintelligibly. I chalked it up to my imagination and exhaustion, but a nagging feeling of unease settled in my gut. Around midnight, I heard a faint, eerie sound. It was like someone calling my name. I unzipped my tent and peered outside, my headlamp cutting through the darkness. There, in the distance, I saw a figure standing on the ridge. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure seemed to be waving at me. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing things, but the figure remained. My heart pounded in my chest as I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response, just the relentless wind. I considered waking up my team, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I decided to investigate on my own, thinking perhaps someone was lost and needed help. I put on my gear and stepped out into the freezing night. As I approached the ridge, the figure seemed to move away, always staying just out of reach. I followed, driven by a strange compulsion. The snow crunched under my boots, and my breath formed icy clouds in the air. Suddenly, I slipped and fell, sliding down a slope and crashing into a snowbank. Dazed, I looked up and realized I was in a part of the mountain I didn't recognize. Panic set in as I tried to get my bearings. The figure was gone, and I was alone in the dark, disoriented and freezing. I fumbled for my radio and called for help, but all I got was static. The wind seemed to whisper my name again, louder this time, almost mocking me. I turned around, desperate to find my way back to camp, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the snow, leading away from me, but they weren't human. They were larger, deeper, and had an odd elongated shape. I followed them, hoping they would lead me back to safety. The footprints led to a small cave, hidden by an overhang of ice. With no other option, I ventured inside. The cave was dark and narrow, but I could see a faint light at the end. As I moved closer, the light grew brighter, revealing carvings on the walls. They depicted scenes of ancient rituals, strange creatures, and climbers from different eras. My heart raced as I realized these were stories of people who had disappeared on Everest over the years. At the end of the cave, I found a small shrine with offerings of old climbing gear, photographs, and personal items. The light emanated from a small, flickering lantern. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned around to see the figure from the ridge, now close enough for me to see its face. It was an old Sherpa, his eyes filled with sorrow. He pointed to the shrine and then to me, as if trying to communicate something important. I was too scared to move, but then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "The mountain takes what it wants. Leave an offering, and you may survive." Trembling, I took off my lucky charm, a pendant my father had given me, and placed it on the shrine. The Sherpa nodded and vanished, leaving me alone in the cave. The whispers faded, and I felt a strange sense of calm. I found my way out of the cave and followed the footprints back to camp. When I returned, my team was relieved to see me. They had been searching for me for hours. I told them what had happened, but they were skeptical, thinking it was just a result of exhaustion and altitude sickness. But I knew the truth. Everest is more than just a mountain. It's a living, breathing entity with its own will. It takes what it wants, and sometimes shows mercy. I left a part of myself on that shrine, and in return, I was spared. I still climb, but I'll never forget the shadows on Everest and the night it almost claimed me.
My name is Mark Stevens, and I never believed in the supernatural until that fateful night in the swamp. It was a humid summer evening, and I was deep in the heart of the Louisiana bayou. I had come to this remote place to research the unique ecosystem for my biology thesis. The swamp was alive with the sounds of nature, the chorus of frogs echoing through the dense foliage. I had always found their croaking somewhat soothing, a reminder of the vibrancy of life in these murky waters. As dusk fell, I set up camp near a small clearing by the water's edge. The air was thick with the smell of decaying vegetation and the constant buzz of insects. I pitched my tent, lit a small fire, and prepared to spend the night recording the nocturnal activities of the swamp's inhabitants. Little did I know that this night would be unlike any other. It started with a sudden silence. The usual cacophony of frogs and insects abruptly ceased, leaving an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. I glanced around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing unusual. Assuming it was just a natural lull, I continued my work. Then I heard it. A low, guttural croak that seemed to come from the depths of the swamp. It was unlike any frog sound I had ever heard, deeper and more resonant, almost like a growl. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured toward the source of the sound. The beam of light flickered as I pushed through the thick underbrush, my boots sinking into the soft, wet ground. The croaking grew louder, more insistent, drawing me deeper into the swamp. I stumbled upon a small clearing, and there, in the dim light of my flashlight, I saw them. Hundreds of frogs, their eyes glowing an unnatural red, were gathered around a large, gnarled tree. At the base of the tree was a small, murky pond, its surface rippling with movement. The frogs were utterly still, their crimson eyes fixed on the water. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't look away. Suddenly, the water began to bubble and churn. A massive, dark shape emerged from the depths, rising slowly. It was a frog, but unlike any frog I had ever seen. It was enormous, at least 3 feet long, its skin mottled and slick with algae. Its eyes were a fiery red, matching those of the smaller frogs, and its mouth opened in a wide, menacing grin. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The giant frog let out a deafening croak, and the smaller frogs responded in unison, their chorus reverberating through the night. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and I realized that I was witnessing something ancient and malevolent. As the giant frog advanced toward me, I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the ground. My flashlight slipped from my grasp and went out, plunging me into darkness. I could feel the ground tremble as the creature approached, its heavy breath hot against my skin. Desperate, I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush, blind with terror. The croaking followed me, relentless and echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my camp, my breath ragged and my body trembling. I grabbed my gear and fled, not daring to look back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw in that swamp. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. The bayou is home to things far older and darker than we can understand. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the swamp, the giant frog and its crimson-eyed followers are still waiting, their ancient croak echoing through the night.
My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how I encountered the Ghost Raider. It started on a cold October night. I was driving back from a late shift at the local diner, the only source of light being the pale glow of my headlights cutting through the thick fog that rolled over the deserted highway. The radio crackled with static, occasionally sputtering out fragments of an old country song. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I blamed it on the cold. I had always been fascinated by ghost stories, but I never really believed in them. That was until I saw him. As I rounded a bend, a figure appeared on the side of the road. Dressed in a tattered old leather jacket, he stood motionless, his eyes glowing an eerie red in the darkness. At first, I thought he was just a hitchhiker, but something about him felt wrong. I slowed down, curiosity getting the better of me. As I got closer, I noticed his face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his breath misted in the chilly air. His motorcycle, a vintage Harley, was parked beside him, looking as ancient and worn as he did. The bike's headlight flickered like a dying candle. "Need a lift?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest, and a sense of dread washed over me. It was then that I realized I was looking at something not of this world. He climbed onto his bike without a word and revved the engine. The sound was deafening, like the roar of 1,000 angry souls. Before I could react, he took off down the highway, his red eyes leaving a trail of light in the fog. I watched in stunned silence as he disappeared into the night. Shaken, I continued my drive home, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. When I finally reached my house, I locked the doors and windows, trying to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the light. But the nightmares started that very night. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of the Ghost Raider's motorcycle echoing in my ears. I saw him in every dark corner, felt his presence lurking just out of sight. My friends and family noticed the change in me, but I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think I was crazy. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to face my fear. I drove back to the spot where I had first seen him. The fog was even thicker this time, the air colder. I parked my car and waited, my heart racing. Hours passed, and just when I was about to give up, I heard it, the unmistakable roar of his motorcycle. The Ghost Raider emerged from the fog, his red eyes burning with an unholy light. He stopped in front of me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dead leaves, he spoke. "You cannot escape me, Daniel Carter. Your soul is marked." With that, He vanished into the night, leaving me alone and trembling. I never saw him again after that, but I could feel his presence, always watching, always waiting. I moved away, changed my name, tried to start a new life. But no matter where I go, I know he'll find me. Because the Ghost Raider never forgets. And he never forgives.
My name is Emily Thompson, and this is the story of the most terrifying experience of my life. I had just moved to the city for my first job after college. I found a small, affordable apartment in an old building downtown. It was nothing fancy, but it was close to work and the rent was within my budget. The only downside was that I needed to share it with a roommate to afford it. I found a roommate through a listing online, a quiet guy named Jake. He seemed normal enough, polite, kept to himself, and paid his share of the rent on time. The first few weeks went smoothly. Jake was often out, leaving early and coming home late. When he was around, he mostly stayed in his room. We exchanged pleasantries and occasionally chatted about mundane things like the weather or the latest TV shows. It was an ideal arrangement, or so I thought. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange noise. It sounded like whispering, but it was too faint to make out any words. I brushed it off as Jake talking in his sleep, or maybe just the sounds of the old building settling. I pulled the covers over my head and went back to sleep. The next night, I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more distinct. It was definitely coming from Jake's room. I got up and walked over to his door, pressing my ear against it. The whispering continued, low and urgent, like a one-sided conversation. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but it sent chills down my spine. The following day, I decided to ask Jake about it. When he came home, I casually brought it up. "Hey Jake, do you talk in your sleep? I heard some noises from your room last night." He looked at me with an odd expression and shook his head. "No, I don't think so. Maybe it was just the building. This place makes all kinds of weird noises at night." I nodded, trying to convince myself that he was right, but the feeling of unease lingered. Over the next few nights, the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I started to notice other strange things too. Objects in the apartment seemed to move on their own. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and find them on the coffee table. The TV would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, the volume blaring. One evening, I came home to find Jake sitting in the dark living room, staring at the blank TV screen. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and he didn't seem to notice me come in. "Jake?" I called softly. "Are you okay?" He slowly turned to look at me, his face pale and drawn. "They don't like you," he whispered. A cold wave of fear washed over me. "Who doesn't like me, Jake?" "Them," he said, pointing to the empty air beside him. "They don't want you here." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Jake, you're scaring me. Who are you talking about?" But he didn't answer. He just got up and walked to his room, closing the door behind him. That night, the whispering was louder than ever. It felt like it was coming from all around me, surrounding me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Sarah, asking if I could crash at her place for a few days. She agreed, sensing the urgency in my voice. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the apartment. I didn't tell Jake I was leaving. I just couldn't face him. At Sarah's place, I finally felt safe. I told her everything, and she suggested I find a new place to live. I agreed, knowing I couldn't go back to that apartment. A few days later, I went back to pack up the rest of my things. The apartment was eerily quiet. Jake's door was open, but he wasn't there. As I packed, I found a small, old notebook under the couch. Curious, I opened it. The pages were filled with Jake's handwriting, but the words made no sense. It was like he had been writing in some sort of code or another language. The last few pages were different, though. They were filled with frantic scribbles and repeated phrases like, "They are here," and "They don't like her." I felt a chill as I realized he had been writing about me. I quickly finished packing and left the apartment, leaving the notebook behind. I moved in with Sarah temporarily while I looked for a new place. A few weeks later, I heard from the landlord. He told me that Jake had moved out suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. He also mentioned that the previous tenant had left under strange circumstances, too. I never found out what really happened in that apartment or who they were. But I do know one thing. I will never forget the feeling of those eyes watching me in the dark and the whispers that still haunt my dreams.
My name is James Carter, and I'm about to tell you the most terrifying story of my life. It all began at a party where I met a woman who would haunt my dreams and waking life alike. It was a warm summer night, and my friend Dave was throwing one of his legendary parties. His house was packed with people, laughter, and the sound of music thumping through the walls. I was nursing a drink in the corner, trying to relax after a long week at work, when I saw her. She was standing alone by the fireplace, her presence almost magnetic. She was strikingly beautiful, with long, raven-black hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow under the dim light. Her red dress clung to her slender frame, and she held herself with an air of effortless grace. I felt a strange pull towards her, an inexplicable need to speak to her. I made my way through the crowd, feeling oddly nervous as I approached. "Hi, I'm James," I said, offering a smile. She turned those intense eyes on me and smiled back, but there was something unsettling about it. "Hello, James. I'm Lila." We chatted for a while, and despite the growing unease in my gut, I found myself captivated by her. She had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, her eyes never leaving mine. But there was an underlying coldness to her gaze, a predatory glint that sent shivers down my spine. As the night wore on, Lila suggested we step outside for some fresh air. I hesitated, but the strange allure she had over me was too strong to resist. We walked out into the garden, the party's noise fading into the background. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the trees, and the night was filled with the sound of chirping crickets. We found a secluded spot near an old oak tree, and Lila leaned against it, her eyes fixed on me. "You know, James," she said softly, "there's something about you that intrigues me." I tried to respond, but my throat felt dry. There was something about her voice, a hypnotic quality that made it hard to think clearly. She stepped closer, her fingers lightly brushing my arm. "Do you believe in fate?" she whispered. Before I could answer, her expression changed. The predatory glint in her eyes intensified, and her smile twisted into something cruel. I took a step back, suddenly feeling like a prey cornered by a predator. "Lila, I should get back to the party," I stammered, my heart racing. She laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the garden. "Oh, James, you can't leave now. We're just getting started." In that moment, everything about her changed. Her eyes darkened to an unnatural black, and her beautiful features contorted into a grotesque mask of malevolence. Her fingers dug into my arm with an inhuman strength, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm free, stumbling back. I turned and ran, the sound of her laughter following me like a shadow. I didn't stop until I was back inside the house, the warmth and noise of the party a stark contrast to the horror outside. I didn't see Lila again that night, but her presence lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes watching me, even in the crowded room. I left the party early, my heart still pounding with fear. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I would catch glimpses of her in mirrors and reflections, her cold, black eyes watching me with that twisted smile. My nights were plagued with nightmares of her chasing me, her laughter echoing in the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the fear was too real. I started avoiding mirrors and reflective surfaces, but it was no use. She was always there, lurking just out of sight, a constant reminder of that night. One evening, I was home alone, trying to focus on a book to distract myself. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a chill filled the room. I looked up, and there she was, standing in the doorway. Her eyes were black voids, her smile a rictus of pure evil. "You can't escape me, James," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. She stepped closer, her form shifting and flickering like a shadow. "Your fear," she hissed. "It feeds me." I ran to the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. I was trapped, my mind racing with terror. She moved closer, her presence suffocating, and I felt my strength ebbing away. In a desperate bid to save myself, I grabbed a mirror from the wall and held it up to her. For a moment, she recoiled, her form flickering and distorting. The sight of her own reflection seemed to weaken her, and I seized the opportunity. I shouted words of defiance, willing her to leave me alone. With a final piercing scream, she vanished, leaving me alone in the now eerily silent house. I collapsed to the floor, my body shaking with relief and exhaustion. Since that night, I haven't seen Lila again. But the memory of her still haunts me, a reminder of the terror that lurks just beyond the veil of our reality. I can only hope that whatever she was, she's gone for good. But deep down, I know that the fear she instilled in me will never truly fade.
My name is Lisa Warren, and I've always had vivid dreams. Sometimes, they're wonderful, fantastical escapes from reality. Other times, they're dark, unsettling experiences that linger long after I wake. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that became all too real. It started on a night like any other. I went to bed early, exhausted from a long day at work. I fell asleep almost instantly, slipping into a dream that felt unusually lucid. In the dream, I was standing in the hallway of my childhood home. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears and makes you acutely aware of every little sound. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. As I reached the living room, I saw someone standing by the window, their back to me. It was a woman with long, dark hair, wearing a white nightgown. She was staring out into the darkness beyond the window. "Mom," I called out, my voice trembling. The woman turned slowly, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't my mother. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. A chilling smile spread across her lips, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick molasses. The woman's laughter echoed through the house, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I stumbled and fell, and as I looked up, she was standing over me, reaching out with long, bony fingers. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a nightmare. But as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it, a low, guttural laugh, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It had to be my imagination. Dreams can do that, blur the line between reality and illusion. I took a deep breath and forced myself to get out of bed. I had to prove to myself that it was just a dream. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark and quiet, just like in my dream. I walked slowly, my footsteps eerily echoing off the walls. As I reached the living room, I saw her, standing by the window, just as she had been in my dream. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. I blinked, hoping she would disappear, but she remained, her dark eyes fixed on me, that chilling smile stretching across her face. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she began to move toward me, her feet not seeming to touch the ground. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but again, my legs felt heavy, as if I were moving through thick molasses. Her laughter filled the house, louder and more menacing. I reached the front door and yanked it open, fleeing into the night. I ran down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of a well-lit gas station. I turned back, expecting to see her following me, but the street was empty. For the next few nights, I stayed at a friend's house, too terrified to return home. I told her about the dream, about the woman, but she just laughed it off, saying I'd been watching too many horror movies. I wanted to believe her, to think that it was all just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Eventually, I had to go back home. I couldn't avoid it forever. I returned during the day, hoping the sunlight would chase away the shadows that haunted my nights. For a while, things seemed normal. The house was just a house, empty and ordinary. But then, the dreams started again. Every night, I found myself back in that hallway, the woman's black eyes staring at me, her laughter echoing through the house. And every night, I woke up to the sound of her laughter, growing closer and closer. I couldn't escape her, not in my dreams, not in reality. She was always there, watching, waiting. I started to see her out of the corner of my eye, in mirrors, in reflections. She was always just a step behind me, no matter where I went. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The line between dream and reality has blurred beyond recognition. I fear that one day, I won't wake up at all. I'll be trapped in that dream, with her, forever.
My name is Lucas Miller, and this is a story I've never told anyone before. I'm not even sure if I should be sharing it now, but the weight of it has become unbearable. Maybe putting it into words will help me understand what happened that night and why I've never felt the same since. It was a late October evening when it all began, the kind of night where the wind cuts through your clothes and the moon hangs low, casting long shadows that seem to have a life of their own. I had been out with some friends, just a casual evening at the pub, nothing out of the ordinary. We laughed, shared stories, and eventually, the night began to wind down. I decided to walk home, needing the fresh air to clear my head. The streets were deserted. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. The path I took was one I'd walked countless times before, through a quiet neighborhood, past the old church, and down the lane that led to my small apartment. But that night, something felt different. There was an unease in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I turned the corner near the church, I noticed a figure standing under the flickering street lamp. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of a hood pulled low. He wore a black jacket that seemed to absorb the light, a void in the otherwise dimly lit street. I don't know why, but something about him made my skin crawl. I quickened my pace, not wanting to make eye contact, hoping to pass by unnoticed. But as I drew closer, the man stepped out from under the lamp, his face still hidden, and began to walk in my direction. My heart raced, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. There was something about the way he moved, deliberate, almost predatory, that sent a shiver down my spine. I kept my head down, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid, that this was just some random guy out for a late-night stroll. But as he got closer, I could sense his eyes on me, watching, studying. The air around me grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. I passed him without incident, but I could feel his presence lingering behind me. I didn't dare look back. My footsteps quickened into a near jog as I made my way down the lane. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. Then I heard it. Footsteps echoing mine. He was following me. Panic surged through me. I broke into a run, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The sound of his footsteps quickened too, matching my pace. I could feel him gaining on me, closing the distance between us. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but the lane was long, and there was nowhere to go. Finally, my apartment came into view. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. The footsteps were right behind me now. I could feel his presence, so close I could almost hear his breath. The door finally gave way, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. I pressed my back against the door, heart pounding, trying to catch my breath. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see him standing there, but the street was empty. The man in the black jacket was gone, vanished into the night as if he had never been there. But the fear didn't leave me. It clung to me like a second skin, a constant reminder that something was out there, watching, waiting. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I would catch glimpses of him in crowds, feel his eyes on me when I was alone. But every time I looked, he was gone, a phantom haunting the edges of my vision. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I can still feel his presence, even now, all these years later. I've moved across the country, changed my name, tried to forget that night, but I can't. Because every now and then, when I'm walking alone at night, I hear it, the sound of footsteps echoing mine, and I know he's still out there, wearing that black jacket, waiting for me, and one day I know he'll catch up.
My name is Ethan Reed, and I've always been skeptical about ghost stories until I experienced one myself. This isn't just a tale to scare you, it's a warning. There are places in this world where the past lingers, where the shadows hold secrets, and sometimes it's better to leave them alone. It was the summer after my grandfather passed away. I was tasked with cleaning out his old farm, a place I hadn't visited since I was a kid. The farm was nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by miles of fields and dense woods. The house was in decent shape, but the barn was different. The barn had always given me an uneasy feeling, even when I was young. It was a massive, weathered structure, its wooden boards warped and cracked with age. The roof sagged in places, and the once red paint had faded to a dull, sickly brown. No one had been inside it for years. At least, that's what I thought. As I walked up to the barn, the air around it felt heavier, colder. The wind seemed to die down, and the usual sounds of the countryside, birds, insects, rustling leaves, faded away, leaving an oppressive silence. I hesitated, my hand on the rusted latch, before finally pushing the creaking door open. Inside, the barn was dark, the only light coming from narrow beams that pierced through the gaps in the wooden walls. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by my presence. The smell of old hay and decaying wood filled my nostrils, but there was something else too, a faint, acrid odor that I couldn't quite place. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I began to explore. Old farming tools were scattered around, covered in dust and cobwebs. The floor was littered with debris, and the rafters above were home to countless birds' nests. But it wasn't the disrepair that bothered me. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. In the far corner of the barn, I noticed something odd, a large, heavy trapdoor set into the floor. I didn't remember ever seeing it before, but then again, I hadn't spent much time in the barn as a child. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. The trapdoor was heavy, but I managed to pry it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. A musty, cold draft blew up from the depths, carrying that same acrid smell, stronger now. I hesitated, a voice in the back of my mind telling me to close the door and leave, but I ignored it. I had to know what was down there. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck and descended the stairs, each step creaking ominously under my weight. The air grew colder as I went deeper, and the smell became almost unbearable, a mix of rot and something metallic. Finally, I reached the bottom, my flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. The basement was large, far larger than I had expected. The walls were lined with shelves, and on those shelves were jars, hundreds of them, filled with murky liquid and what looked like small, twisted objects suspended inside. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, but as I moved closer, the horrific reality dawned on me. The jars contained remains, preserved organs, bones, and other things I couldn't identify. Some were clearly animal, but others looked disturbingly human. My stomach churned, and I felt bile rise in my throat. As I stood there, horrified, I heard something behind me, a faint, shuffling sound. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. The sound came again, closer this time, and then I saw it. In the shadows, near the staircase, a figure stood watching me. It was tall and thin, its body twisted in unnatural ways. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the beam of my flashlight. For a moment, I was frozen with fear, unable to move as it slowly crept toward me. The figure stepped into the light, and I saw it clearly, a gaunt skeletal thing with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, and its eyes were filled with rage, with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I turned and ran, scrambling up the stairs as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind me, I could hear the thing following, its footsteps unnaturally fast, gaining on me with every second. I burst out of the trapdoor, slamming it shut behind me and throwing a heavy crate on top for good measure. I didn't stop running until I was in my truck, speeding away from the farm as fast as the old engine would allow. In the rearview mirror, the barn stood ominously in the distance. The trapdoor still closed, but I knew that whatever I had seen wasn't trapped down there. It was free now, and I had no idea what it would do next. I've never gone back to the farm, and I never will. I sold the property as soon as I could, but I never told anyone about the basement, about the jars, or about the thing I saw. Some secrets are better left buried, and some places are better left forgotten. But every now and then, I have nightmares of that barn, of the trapdoor, and of the thing that lurked in the darkness, waiting for me.
My name is Jacob Lawson, and I've been blind for as long as I can remember. It's not something I dwell on. I've learned to navigate the world without sight, relying on my other senses to fill in the gaps. But recently, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about the darkness I live in. It started on a quiet evening at home. I was alone, as I often am, listening to the soft hum of my apartment. The ticking of the old clock on the wall, the distant sound of traffic outside, and the comforting rhythmic breathing of my guide dog Max were all familiar to me. They formed the backdrop of my life, a world built from sound and touch. That evening, though, something changed. It began with a feeling, a cold, creeping sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was just my imagination, but the feeling grew stronger, more intense until it was impossible to ignore. Max, usually calm and steady, started to whimper softly. He nudged my leg, his fur bristling under my hand. I could tell he was uneasy, but I couldn't understand why. There was no sound, no strange smell, nothing to indicate that anything was wrong. And yet, the air felt different, thicker, colder. I stood up, my cane tapping the floor as I moved through the room, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. But no matter where I went, it followed me, like a shadow that I couldn't escape. I reached out, feeling the familiar textures of the furniture, the walls, but everything seemed off, wrong somehow. Then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, just on the edge of my hearing. It was so soft that I thought I might be imagining it, but as I strained to listen, it became clearer. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a sound, a low, murmuring hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My heart started to race, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. I turned my head, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it shifted, moving around me like a predator circling its prey. Max growled low in his throat, a sound I had never heard from him before. I backed up, my cane tapping the floor faster now, my movements more frantic. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I felt something brush against my arm, something cold and damp. I recoiled, my skin crawling with a sensation I couldn't describe. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. There was no response, just that endless whispering, growing louder, more chaotic, until it filled my head, drowning out everything else. I felt something else then, a presence, something tangible in the room with me. It was close, too close, and the air around me grew colder, like ice settling into my bones. I turned in its direction, my hand outstretched, but all I felt was empty air. Then, without warning, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow up the world. I stood there, frozen in place, every nerve in my body on edge, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then, in that silence, I heard a voice. It was clear, unmistakable, and it spoke directly into my mind. "I see you, Jacob." I gasped, stumbling back, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. The voice was like nothing I had ever heard before. Cold, devoid of emotion, and yet somehow familiar. It echoed in my head, repeating the same phrase over and over. "I see you." I tried to respond, to ask who or what it was, but my voice caught in my throat. My hands shook, my pulse pounded in my ears, and all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear. Max whimpered again, pressing against my leg, and I could feel his body trembling as much as mine was. Whatever this thing was, it was real, and it was here, in my home, in my world of darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the cold began to recede, the air slowly warming back to normal. The presence faded, and the whispering was gone, leaving only the familiar sounds of my apartment. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't really gone. It was still there, watching me, waiting. And the most terrifying part was that somehow it could see me, even in the darkness. I've tried to convince myself that it was just a hallucination, a trick of my mind, but I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. I've always lived in a world without sight, but now I feel like I'm being watched by something that sees more than I ever could. I still hear the voice sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and still. It's always the same, repeating those 3 words over and over. A chilling reminder that in the darkness, I am never truly alone. I see you, Jacob.
My name is Captain Jonathan Mercer, and this is the story of the night I encountered the Black Marlin, a ghost ship that haunted the deepest waters of the Atlantic. The memory of that fateful night is one that will haunt me until my dying breath, for what I witnessed defied all logic and left an indelible mark on my soul. The night was eerily calm as the north wind sailed under a moonless sky, the stars obscured by thick, rolling clouds. We were en route from Portsmouth to New York, a routine journey I'd made countless times. But something felt off, a creeping unease that settled over the crew and myself like a shroud. It started with the fog, a dense, impenetrable mist that swallowed the ship whole. The lanterns barely pierced the gloom, their light reduced to faint, glowing orbs. The crew whispered of bad omens, their voices hushed with fear, but I dismissed their concerns. After all, I was a man of the sea, and the sea held no terrors for me. Or so I thought. As the fog thickened, a shape emerged from the murk, barely visible at first. I strained my eyes, trying to make sense of it. It was another ship, but not just any ship. The vessel was enormous, its hull towering above the water, covered in barnacles and draped in seaweed like a shroud. It sailed silently, without a single ripple disturbing the still water. My heart pounded as I realized what it was, a ghost ship. The crew gasped in terror as the ship drew closer, its details becoming clearer. The Black Marlin. I'd heard tales of her, a cursed ship lost at sea centuries ago, doomed to sail the oceans for eternity. But I had never believed the stories. Until now. The Black Marlin glided alongside us, its decks eerily empty. The sails, tattered and torn, billowed in a wind we could not feel. And then, from the darkness, figures emerged, phantoms of men long dead. Their hollow eyes stared through us, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish and despair. They were the lost souls of the Black Marlin's crew, trapped between life and death, forever bound to their cursed ship. A cold wind swept across the deck of the North Wind, and the temperature plummeted. The crew huddled together, their breath visible in the frigid air. I tried to rally them, to remind them that we were alive, but my voice faltered. The words caught in my throat as a figure appeared at the helm of the Black Marlin, a ghostly captain, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes burning with an otherworldly light. He pointed a skeletal finger at me, and in that moment, I felt the weight of his curse. The Black Marlin was not just a ship, it was the harbinger of doom, seeking to claim the souls of those who crossed its path. I knew then that we were doomed, trapped in the grip of a force beyond our understanding. The fog thickened, swallowing the Black Marlin once more, but the dread lingered. The crew was in a frenzy, their fear palpable. And then, without warning, the Black Marlin vanished, as if it had never been there. The fog lifted, and the night was calm once more. But the damage had been done. The crew was broken, their spirits shattered by the encounter. In the days that followed, the crew began to disappear, one by one, without a trace. It was as if the Black Marlin had marked them, claiming them as its own. I searched every inch of the ship, but there was no sign of them. Only their empty cabins, their belongings left behind as if they'd simply vanished into thin air. Now, as I sit alone in my cabin, the last of the crew, I can feel the pull of the Black Marlin. I know it is only a matter of time before it comes for me too. The night is calm, but I can hear the faint sound of a ship's bell in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. The black marlin is coming, and there is no escape.
My name is Sarah, and I'll never forget the summer I spent at my Aunt Margaret's house. The memories of those days still haunt me, creeping into my thoughts when I least expect it. It was the summer before I turned 16. My parents were going through a rough patch and decided to take a trip to rekindle their marriage, or so they said. They left me with Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister, in her big, creaky house at the edge of a sleepy little town. Aunt Margaret was a peculiar woman, always keeping to herself, and I barely knew her. My mother had spoken about her in hushed tones, with a mixture of pity and unease, but I never understood why. From the moment I arrived, the house felt wrong. It was as if the walls were watching me, silently observing my every move. The air inside was thick and heavy, with a faint smell of decay lingering in the corners. Aunt Margaret greeted me with a tight-lipped smile and cold eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. The first few nights were uneventful, though the oppressive silence of the house made it difficult to sleep. I often heard strange noises, soft whispers, faint footsteps in the hallway, but whenever I gathered the courage to investigate, I found nothing. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered downstairs to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed Aunt Margaret's closed bedroom door, I heard it again, those whispers, louder this time. I pressed my ear to the door, and my heart froze. It wasn't just one voice. There were many, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I knocked lightly, trying to dismiss the growing dread in my chest. The voices stopped abruptly. I called out to Aunt Margaret, but there was no answer. I slowly opened the door, my hand trembling. The room was dark, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the window. Aunt Margaret was lying in bed, perfectly still, her back facing me. I whispered her name, but she didn't move. A sense of unease gnawed at me as I stepped closer. The air around her bed was freezing, and I could see my breath fog in the air. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but as soon as my fingers brushed her skin, she bolted upright, her eyes wide open and staring straight ahead. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Aunt Margaret didn't look at me. She seemed to be in a trance, her eyes glassy and unblinking. Her lips moved as she muttered something under her breath, too low for me to hear. I wanted to run, but I was rooted to the spot by a fear so intense it felt like a vice around my heart. Suddenly, Aunt Margaret turned her head towards me, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her eyes locked onto mine, and a twisted smile spread across her face. "You shouldn't be here, Sarah," she whispered in a voice that wasn't her own. It was deep and raspy, as if something else was speaking through her. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me, and raced back to my own bedroom. I locked the door and sat on the bed, my entire body shaking. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. The next morning, Aunt Margaret was back to her old self, acting as if nothing had happened. I tried to bring it up, but she just smiled and told me I must have been dreaming. But I knew better. Something was wrong with her, something deeply, horribly wrong. As the days passed, the strange occurrences intensified. I would catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of my vision, hear voices calling my name from empty rooms. Aunt Margaret grew more distant, often disappearing into the basement for hours. She forbade me from going down there, claiming it was her private space. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was happening in that basement. When I was sure Aunt Margaret was asleep, I crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky spots in the floorboards. The basement door was slightly ajar, a dim light spilling out from the cracks. I pushed the door open and descended the stairs, the cold air biting at my skin. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and dusty boxes, but in the center of the room, there was something else. An altar of sorts, covered in strange symbols and surrounded by candles, their flames flickering in the darkness. And there, in front of the altar, was Aunt Margaret, kneeling with her back to me, chanting in that same guttural voice I'd heard that first night. Her hands were stained with something dark, and as she turned to face me, I saw the madness in her eyes. "You shouldn't have come here, Sarah," she hissed, her voice twisting with malice. "Now it's too late." Before I could react, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive. swirling around her like a dark, malevolent force. I felt them closing in on me, cold and suffocating, pulling me towards the altar. Aunt Margaret began to laugh, a sound so chilling it echoed in my bones. I don't remember how I got out of that basement. The next thing I knew, I was running down the street, the house disappearing behind me in the mist. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest neighbor's house, pounding on the door, screaming for help. When the police arrived, they found the basement empty, the altar gone. Aunt Margaret was sitting calmly in her living room, denying everything, her eyes devoid of any emotion. They didn't believe me, of course, chalking it up to a frightened teenager's overactive imagination. But I know what I saw. I know what she is. And even now, years later, I can still hear her laughter in my nightmares, still feel the cold grip of those shadows whenever I close my eyes. I haven't been back to that house since. I never will.
My name is Michael, and I'll never forget the night I decided to take the long way home. It was a late autumn evening, and I had stayed at work much later than usual. The office was nearly empty when I finally left, and the cold air outside bit at my face as I walked to my car. The streets were quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. I usually took the main road home, but that night I felt an inexplicable urge to take a different route, a winding, narrow road that cut through a thick, dark forest. I'd driven it once before during the day, and I remembered it being a peaceful, scenic drive. But at night it was a different story. As soon as I turned onto the road, I felt a sense of unease. The trees loomed tall on either side, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. My headlights barely penetrated the darkness ahead, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if leading me deeper into the unknown. A few miles in, I noticed something strange. The trees on either side of the road seemed to close in, their branches almost touching, creating a tunnel of darkness. The road itself began to narrow, and I had to slow down to avoid veering off into the ditch. That's when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road just ahead. It was a woman, her pale skin almost glowing in the darkness. She wore a long, tattered dress, and her hair hung in damp, tangled strands around her face. She didn't move as I approached, just stood there, staring at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. I slowed to a crawl, unsure of what to do. She looked like she needed help, but there was something about her that set off alarm bells in my head. My heart pounded as I rolled down the window, just enough to ask if she was okay. "Do you need a ride?" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond, didn't even blink. Instead, she slowly raised her arm and pointed down the road, into the pitch-black darkness ahead. A chill ran down my spine. Everything in me screamed to drive away, to turn around and take the main road home. But something compelled me to keep going, to follow the direction she was pointing. I drove past her, keeping my eyes on the road ahead, but I couldn't resist glancing in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The road behind me was empty, as if she had never been there. The further I drove, the more surreal everything became. The trees pressed in closer, their branches scraping against the sides of the car like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to rise from the ground, obscuring the road. Then I saw it, a house, barely visible through the fog, sitting just off the road. It was old and decrepit, its windows dark and empty. The sight of it filled me with a sense of dread so intense that I almost stopped the car. But before I could, the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in front of the house. I tried to restart the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. Panic set in, and I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Suddenly, I heard a noise. A soft, shuffling sound coming from the direction of the house. I looked up, and through the fog, I saw the front door slowly creak open. My breath caught in my throat as a shadowy figure emerged from the doorway, moving towards me with an unnatural, jerky gait. I fumbled with the car keys, desperate to get the engine started, but it was no use. The figure was getting closer, and I could now make out its features. A twisted, distorted version of the woman I had seen earlier, her face a mask of rage and despair. She reached the car and pressed her face against the window, her eyes burning with an unnatural light. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the car roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing down the road without looking back. The fog swallowed the house behind me, and the trees began to thin out as I finally reached the main road. When I got home, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the door. I locked every window and door, but sleep never came that night. All I could think about was the woman's lifeless eyes and the terror that had gripped me on that dark, twisted road. I never took that route again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear her whispering my name, calling me back to that long, lonely road where she waits for me.
My name is Tom, and I've always been skeptical of ghost stories. But when I started working at Grady's Fish and Chips, the oldest chip shop in our small town, I began to reconsider. The shop had been a beloved fixture for decades, but after old Mr. Grady passed away and his disinterested son Dave took over, things changed. I'd worked there during high school and knew the place like the back of my hand, so when Dave offered me a part-time job, I accepted without hesitation. From the moment I walked in, though, I could sense something was off. The air was thick and heavy, and the once welcoming smell of frying fish was tainted with a hint of rot. The first few nights went by without incident, but the strange feeling never left me. I'd hear odd noises, footsteps in the back when I was alone, the fryer turning itself on and off, and sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. I chalked it up to my imagination, but the unease grew stronger with each passing day. One Friday night, Dave asked me to close up. Business had been slow, and by 9 p.m., I was alone. As I wiped down the counters, the lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. I heard the familiar creak of the storeroom door opening, even though I knew I'd shut it earlier. My heart raced as I walked toward the back, trying to convince myself it was nothing. As I approached the storeroom, I heard a faint whisper my name, spoken so softly I almost thought I imagined it. Tom. I stopped in my tracks, a chill running down my spine. The storeroom door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see something, a dark figure standing in the corner. My stomach dropped as I recognized the face. It was Mr. Grady, his once kindly features now twisted in anger, his eyes hollow and dark. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice cold and otherworldly. I staggered back, the terror freezing me in place. Mr. Grady's ghostly figure stepped forward, his expression growing more menacing with each passing second. My body finally kicked into gear, and I ran sprinting out of the shop, leaving everything behind. I didn't stop until I was in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I never went back to Grady's Fish and Chips after that night. Dave thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. The shop was eventually sold, and the new owners turned it into a cafe. The haunting supposedly stopped, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Sometimes, I drive past the old chip shop, now bustling with people enjoying their lattes and pastries. But every time I do, I can't help but feel that somewhere in the shadows, Mr. Grady is still there, watching, waiting, and ready to make sure no one ever forgets who truly owned that fryer.
My name is Sarah, and I've always had a love for animals. As a child, I spent countless weekends at Hollow Creek Zoo, a small, run-down place that had seen better days. But despite its shabby appearance, the zoo held a special place in my heart. I hadn't been there in years, not since I left for college, but when I returned to my hometown, nostalgia got the better of me. I decided to visit one last time. The first thing that struck me as I walked through the rusty gates was how quiet the place was. The usual sounds of animals were absent. No chirping birds, no growling lions. It was as if the whole zoo was holding its breath. The air was thick, heavy with a strange smell that I couldn't quite place, like wet fur mixed with something rotten. I wandered through the empty paths, passing enclosures that looked neglected, the cages rusted and overgrown with weeds. The animals were there, but they seemed wrong. The lion in its cage had a dull, lifeless gaze, its once majestic mane matted and thin. The monkeys sat in a corner of their enclosure, unmoving, their eyes following me with an unnerving intensity. The deeper I went into the zoo, the worse the feeling got. I reached the reptile house, a place that always creeped me out as a kid, but curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped inside. The air was cooler, but the smell was stronger here, more pungent, like something was decaying. The lights inside the reptile house were dim, casting long shadows that made the narrow hallway seem endless. The glass tanks were covered in grime, making it hard to see the creatures inside. I pressed my face close to one of the tanks, trying to make out what was inside. When I saw it, something that didn't belong. It was a snake, but not like any I'd ever seen. Its eyes were too large, almost human, and its body was twisted in unnatural ways. The moment it met my gaze, it slithered closer to the glass, its mouth opening slightly as if it was trying to speak. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly backed away, my heart pounding. I turned to leave, but the sound of a low, guttural growl stopped me in my tracks. It was coming from the other end of the hallway. Slowly, I turned around, my blood running cold as I saw something emerging from the shadows. It was a large figure, hunched over, its body covered in matted fur. At first, I thought it was one of the zoo animals that had somehow escaped, but as it stepped into the dim light, I realized it was something far worse. Its face was twisted, almost human, but with sharp, animalistic features. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent intelligence, and its mouth was filled with rows of sharp teeth, bared in a snarl. I stumbled back, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature let out another growl, this one more aggressive, and began to move towards me. Panic took over, and I bolted for the exit, my footsteps echoing loudly in the narrow hallway. I could hear the creature behind me, its claws scraping against the floor, getting closer with each passing second. I burst out of the reptile house and into the open air, but the sense of safety was short-lived. The entire zoo seemed to be coming alive, the animals stirring in their cages, their eyes following me with a disturbing awareness. I could hear strange noises all around me, growls, hisses, and whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran towards the exit, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but when I reached the gate, it was closed, the heavy metal chains wrapped tightly around it. Desperation filled me as I pulled at the chains, but they wouldn't budge. Then from behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I turned around, my back pressed against the gate, and saw the creature from the reptile house standing just a few feet away. It was joined by others now, twisted, monstrous versions of the zoo animals, all with those same malevolent eyes, watching me with predatory intent. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The creatures began to move closer, their growls growing louder, more threatening. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized there was no escape. The last thing I remember is their eyes, glowing in the darkness as they closed in on me. They say Hollow Creek Zoo closed down not long after that, abandoned without explanation. No one knows what happened to the animals, and no one dares to go near the place anymore. But sometimes, on quiet nights, people claim they can still hear the faint sound of growls and whispers coming from the direction of the old zoo. I wouldn't know. I never left.
My name is Jack, and I was never one to believe in the supernatural. When I took a night shift job at the old poultry factory on the edge of town, I wasn't expecting much, just a paycheck and some long hours. The factory itself was a massive, decrepit place, filled with endless rows of conveyor belts, clanking machines, and the overwhelming stench of chicken and blood. The other workers kept to themselves, and there was something about them that seemed off, but I shrugged it off as part of the job. It wasn't until my second week that I started noticing things that didn't add up. One night, as I was working near the processing area, the usual noise of the factory suddenly faded. The clattering of machines, the hum of conveyor belts, the clucking of chickens, it all went silent. The air grew thick and cold, and a strange, rhythmic clucking sound started up from the far end of the room. It was different from the usual noise, more mechanical, almost like a broken record stuck on repeat. I followed the sound, which led me to a door marked restricted access. I had never seen anyone go in or out of that room before. The clucking grew louder, more erratic, as I hesitated in front of the door. My instincts told me to turn back, but something compelled me to open it. Inside, the room was dark and cold, the walls lined with rusty cages filled with chickens. But these weren't ordinary chickens, their eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and they watched me with an unsettling, almost human-like intelligence. The clucking turned into desperate cries as the chickens began to thrash violently in their cages. Suddenly, one of the chickens spoke, its voice a distorted, guttural whisper, "Help us." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The chicken's cries grew louder, more frantic, and the room seemed to close in on me. The door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. I backed away, stumbling towards a large, metal machine in the corner. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a heap of mangled remains, a grotesque mix of human and chicken parts twisted together and slick with blood. The machine was grinding bones, feathers, and flesh, the sound growing louder as the room filled with an oppressive, suffocating energy. I turned to run, but the workers were there, blocking the exit, their eyes glowing the same yellow as the chickens. They moved towards me, their faces blank, their movements slow and deliberate, like puppets controlled by unseen strings. Panic surged through me as I realized there was no escape. The last thing I remember is the sound of the machine, the grinding of bones and flesh as the workers closed in, their dead eyes locking onto me. The factory was shut down a few days later, the owner citing unforeseen circumstances. No one talks about what happened, and the building was left to rot. But sometimes, late at night, people claim they can still hear the faint sound of clucking, echoing from deep within the abandoned factory.
My name is Sarah, and I've always loved running through the forest trails near my house. They were my sanctuary, a place to clear my mind. But after that night, I've never set foot near those woods again. It was late October, and the days had already started to shrink. I decided to go for a quick evening jog before it got too dark. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under my feet. I remember feeling the cool breeze on my face and the satisfaction of pushing my body through the familiar path. It was just me, the trail, and the bushes on either side. But as I ventured deeper into the woods, a strange feeling washed over me, a prickling unease, as if I was being watched. I brushed it off at first. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, or so I thought. But then, I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes to my right. I stopped and stared, peering into the dense foliage. Nothing. I convinced myself it was just a small animal and kept running. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer, louder. The bushes swayed as if something or someone was moving through them. My heart pounded in my chest and I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence answered me back. I stood there, straining my ears, but all I could hear was the sound of my own heavy breathing. I continued to run faster this time, hoping to shake off whatever irrational fear was creeping into my thoughts. But then, just as I was about to round the corner of the path, I heard my name, whispered, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Sarah. I froze. My blood ran cold. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was hoarse and ragged, like nails scraping against glass. I whipped around, scanning the bushes, but they were still. Nothing was there. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. Again, silence. The bushes were unnervingly still, yet I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. I started to back away slowly, my eyes fixed on the spot where the whisper had come from. And then I saw it. A pale hand reaching out from the bushes, claw-like fingers curling around the branches. I gasped, stumbling back, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard, my head hitting the ground, dazing me for a second. When I looked up, the hand was gone, and the bushes were still again. Panicking, I scrambled to my feet and sprinted back the way I came, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. But the whispers followed me, growing louder, overlapping, all saying my name in that same raspy tone. Sarah? Sarah? Sarah! I burst out of the woods, collapsing onto the pavement of the parking lot. I was shaking, gasping for breath. I glanced back, half expecting to see whatever had been hiding in those bushes. But there was nothing. Just the dark line of trees swaying gently in the wind. I never went back to those trails. I never wanted to know what was in those bushes. All I know is that it knew my name, and it was waiting for me.
My name is Jessica, and I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, doppelgangers, they were all just stories to me. That is, until I met mine. It all started a few weeks ago. I was leaving work late, the last person in the office as usual. I work in a downtown high-rise, and at that hour, the building was eerily quiet. As I stepped into the elevator, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored walls. I brushed my hair back and adjusted my coat, ready to head home. The elevator door slid shut, and I hit the button for the lobby. But then, the lights flickered, and the elevator shuddered to a stop between floors. I groaned, pressing the emergency button, but there was no response. Just my luck. I checked my phone, no signal. I sighed and leaned against the mirrored wall, staring at my reflection. That's when I noticed it. My reflection was smiling. I wasn't. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. I waved my hand, and my reflection waved back, but the smile stayed. My heart began to race. I stepped closer, examining the mirror. My reflection's eyes locked onto mine, its grin widening unnaturally, stretching too far, showing too many teeth. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the elevator's opposite wall, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the elevator jolted back to life. The doors opened to the lobby, and I bolted out, not daring to look back at the mirror. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd imagined it. But the unease lingered. Over the next few days, things got weirder. I started noticing strange things happening around me. I'd come home to find the TV on, even though I was sure I'd turned it off. My clothes would be rearranged in my closet, and I'd find doors open that I knew I'd closed. At first, I thought maybe I was just being forgetful, but then my friends started acting strange too. It began with texts from my best friend, Megan. She was upset that I'd ignored her when we ran into each other at the grocery store. But I hadn't been to the grocery store that day. I tried to explain that it wasn't me, but she didn't believe me. Then my boss called, asking why I hadn't shown up for our meeting. But I'd been sitting at my desk all morning. My coworkers said they'd seen me walk out of the office hours earlier. Panic set in. I couldn't understand what was happening. It was as if someone was living my life, making me look like a liar, a flake, a completely different person. I decided to confront it, whatever it was. One night, I set up my phone to record while I slept. I needed proof that I wasn't going crazy. The next morning, I reviewed the footage. My heart stopped when I saw it. Around 2 a.m., the bedroom door creaked open, and I watched in horror as I entered the room. But it wasn't me. It was dressed in my clothes, its hair identical to mine, but there was something off about its movements. Jerky, unnatural, like it was still learning how to be me. It walked over to my side of the bed and just stood there, staring down at me. For hours, it watched, its head twitching slightly, a grotesque mimicry of a human. Then, just before dawn, it left the room, leaving the door ajar. I couldn't breathe. My skin prickled with fear. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, but the evidence was right there in front of me. That thing, that doppelganger, was real, and it was getting bolder. The next day, I called in sick and stayed home, determined to catch it in the act. I spent the day on high alert, every noise making me jump. As evening approached, I stationed myself in the living room, clutching a baseball bat. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just when I started to think it might not show, I heard the front door creak open. I held my breath as footsteps echoed down the hall. The air was thick with tension, my palms sweating around the bat's handle. And then it rounded the corner. It was me, down to the last detail, but its eyes were dark, soulless, and that same unnatural smile spread across its face. I lifted the bat, my hands shaking, but it just stood there, watching me with an eerie calmness. Who are you? I demanded, my voice cracking. It tilted its head, still smiling, and whispered in a voice that sounded just like mine. I'm you. With a burst of courage, I swung the bat, but it moved impossibly fast, dodging my strike and disappearing into the shadows of the house. I searched every room, every closet, but it was gone. The doors were locked, the windows shut. It was as if it had never been there. Now I see it everywhere. In the reflection of a shop window, in the rearview mirror of my car, always watching, always smiling. I don't know what it wants, but I know it's waiting. And the worst part is, no one believes me. To everyone else, it looks just like me. I've started avoiding mirrors. I can't trust my own reflection anymore. Because one day, I know it's gonna stop pretending, and then it won't just be me watching. It will be the one living my life, and I'll be the one left behind, trapped in the shadows, watching through eyes that aren't mine.
My name is Mark, and I've always been an avid hiker. I love the solitude of the mountains and the freedom of exploring new trails. But there's one hike that I wish I'd never taken. It was supposed to be a routine weekend trip, a quick escape from the city, alone in the wilderness. But it turned into a nightmare that I can't shake. It was a crisp morning in early November when I set out. The sky was clear, and the trailhead was quiet. I had planned to hike a loop trail in the nearby national park, one that I'd never tried before, but had read about online. The trail was supposed to be a moderate, well-marked path with stunning views. I was excited to tackle it. I parked my car, strapped on my backpack, and started down the path. The first couple of miles were perfect. Cool air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and not a soul in sight. But then, about an hour into my hike, I came to a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. One path was clearly the main trail, and the other was an overgrown side path. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take the overgrown path, thinking it might lead to some hidden viewpoint or secluded spot. As I pushed through the thick brush, the air seemed to grow colder and the forest darker. The further I went, the less it felt like I was on any kind of trail at all. I checked my phone for GPS, but I had no signal. I shrugged it off and kept going, convinced that I'd find something interesting just a bit further ahead. After another half hour, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. It was small, with rotting wood and broken windows. My heart pounded with a mix of fear and excitement. Who would have built a cabin all the way out here? It seemed abandoned, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. Against my better judgment, I approached the cabin. As I got closer, I noticed strange symbols carved into the wood around the door. Symbols I didn't recognize, and they looked freshly made, as if someone had been there recently. I reached for the door, hesitated, and then pushed it open. The hinges creaked loudly, echoing in the stillness of the forest. Inside, the cabin was bare except for a single wooden chair in the center of the room and a thick layer of dust covering the floor. But what caught my eye was a notebook lying on the chair. I picked it up and flipped through the pages. They were filled with frantic, scrawled writing. Don't follow the path. It changes. It leads you back. It wants you lost. A chill ran down my spine. I slammed the notebook shut and bolted out of the cabin, my pulse racing. I needed to get back to the main trail, but when I turned around, the path I had taken was gone. In its place was a dense thicket of trees and brambles. I spun around trying to get my bearings, but everything looked the same, endless trees and tangled underbrush. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction I turned seemed wrong. Panic set in as the sky began to darken, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the trees. I walked for what felt like hours, but no matter how far I went, I kept ending up back at that damn cabin. It was as if the forest was playing tricks on me, leading me in circles, mocking my every move. As night fell, I had no choice but to take shelter in the cabin. The air inside felt heavy, suffocating. I sat in the chair, clutching the notebook, rereading the frantic warnings until my eyes burned. My head ached, and every sound outside made me jump. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift in the darkness, twisting and changing when I wasn't looking. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for morning. When the first light of dawn finally broke, I stepped outside, praying the trail would be there, praying I'd find my way back. But the path was still gone, and the forest looked even more twisted than before. It took me 3 days to find my way out. 3 days of wandering in circles, of seeing that cabin over and over, no matter which direction I went. When I finally stumbled back onto a marked trail, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified out of my mind. I never figured out what happened in those woods, and I never went back. I still hear the forest in my dreams sometimes, whispers of the trees, the crunch of unseen footsteps, and that cabin waiting for me at the end of the path that wasn't there.
My name is Sarah Thompson, and like everyone else, I hate Mondays. But this Monday wasn't just the typical grind, it was something far worse. I woke up to my alarm blaring, red digits flashing 6 a.m. Groaning, I slapped it off and dragged myself through my usual morning routine. Everything felt hazy, like I was moving through thick fog. I grabbed my coffee from the corner cafe and trudged into my office building, only to notice something odd: the lobby was empty. Usually it was buzzing with people, but today it was just silent. I shrugged it off and took the elevator up to my floor. The office was eerily quiet, and my footsteps echoed in the dimly lit space. I sat at my desk, turned on my computer, and started my day. But as I glanced at the clock, it read 8:15 a.m. I worked for what felt like hours, but every time I checked the clock, it still showed 8:15 a.m. I refreshed my phone, 8:15. I checked the wall clock, 8:15. The realization hit me like a cold wave. I was stuck. The time wasn't moving. I tried calling my coworker Jenna, but her phone buzzed on her desk, and she was nowhere to be seen. The office was empty, the silence pressing against my ears. I dialed my parents, friends, anyone who might answer. Every call went straight to voicemail. Panic surged through me as I ran to the elevator, but the buttons were unresponsive. The stairwell was worse. No matter how many flights I descended, I always ended up on the same floor. My heart pounded as I banged on doors and screamed for help, but there was no response, just my own voice echoing back at me. I returned to my desk, the computer screen glaring at me with the same emails, all stamped 8:15 a.m. Hours blurred into one another, and the darkness outside never lifted. I was trapped in an endless loop, the same minute repeating itself over and over alone. I don't know how long I've been here now, days, weeks. Time has lost all meaning. My food and water are running low. I'm writing this in the hopes that someone finds it, that someone understands what happened here. Because it's still Monday. It's always Monday. And I'm stuck, forever trapped in the beginning of a week that never ends.
My name is Alex Parker, and I never thought a simple yard sale find would turn my life into a nightmare. It was a bright Saturday morning when I spotted the old toy robot buried under a pile of forgotten junk. It was a vintage piece, red and blue, with big round eyes and a wind-up key on its back. I bought it for $1, thinking it would make a cool addition to my collection. When I got home, I set it on my workbench in the garage, eager to see if it still worked. I flicked the switch on its side, but nothing happened. The robot was just a lifeless hunk of metal. I left it there and went about my day, not giving it much thought. That night, I woke up to a faint whirring sound. Groggy, I sat up and listened, but the house was still. Figuring it was just the old pipes or my imagination, I went back to sleep. The next morning, though, I found the robot in the middle of the garage floor, far from where I'd left it. Maybe it had fallen, I thought, though it seemed unlikely. I put it back on the shelf, but the following night, the noise returned, mechanical whirring, followed by a soft click click click. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the garage, my pulse quickening. There it was, the robot standing upright on the workbench, staring at me with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. A shiver ran down my spine. I picked it up and noticed the wind-up key was slowly turning on its own, despite the switch still being off. I shook it, trying to make it stop, but the key kept turning, clicking louder with each rotation. Suddenly, the robot's eyes lit up with a bright red glow, and it moved, a slow, jerky motion as it raised one tiny arm, pointing straight at me. The robot's mouth opened, and a garbled voice crackled out, distorted like an old tape. "Help me!" The words sent a chill through my bones, and I dropped it, watching as it clattered to the floor. But instead of lying still, it slowly sat up, its gaze fixed on me. I tried to smash it with a hammer, but the robot screamed, a high-pitched, ear-splitting noise that filled the entire garage. I covered my ears and backed away, my heart racing. The noise stopped abruptly, and I was left alone in the dark, panting and terrified. The next morning, I found the robot in the kitchen, standing on the counter as if mocking me. I grabbed it, rushed outside, and buried it deep in the backyard, hoping that would be the end of it. That night, I heard the whirring sound again, this time right outside my bedroom door. I bolted upright, drenched in sweat. The robot's voice echoed in the hallway, louder now, clearer. "Help me!" I don't know where the toy came from or why it seems so desperate to find me, but I know it's still out there, waiting. Every night the sound gets closer, no matter how far I try to run.
My name is Yasmin, and I never believed in the supernatural until I moved into my grandmother's old house. It was a small, dilapidated cottage on the outskirts of town, isolated and forgotten. After she passed, the house fell to me, and I planned to clean it out and sell it. But from the moment I stepped inside, I felt something was wrong. The air was heavy and still, and the house felt like it was holding its breath. As I walked through the dusty rooms, I heard faint whispers, too soft to understand but enough to make my skin crawl. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the wind or my nerves. But the whispers didn't stop. In the living room, I found an old wooden box, intricately carved and hidden in a dusty corner. Inside were prayer beads, a small piece of cloth, and an old, rusty key. As I held the key, I heard my name whispered softly from behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The air was cold, and the whispers grew louder, circling me like a breeze. I tried to focus on my task, but the whispers followed me, growing louder each night. Shadows danced on the walls, moving unnaturally. I could feel something watching me, just out of sight. I reached out to my aunt, who told me stories of the jinn, spirits my grandmother feared. She believed a jinn had attached itself to her, and now it was here, in the house, with me. One night, the whispers became unbearable, echoing through the walls, overlapping and urgent. I locked myself in the bedroom, clutching the prayer beads from the box. The air grew cold, and the door rattled as if something was trying to get in. Shadows seeped under the door, twisting and writhing, forming a dark figure with burning eyes. The figure loomed over me, the air heavy and electric. I held up the rusty key in desperation, and the shadow recoiled, hissing like steam. It retreated, dissolving into the floor and disappearing under the door, leaving only silence and a faint, acrid smell. I fled the house that night, leaving everything behind. I keep the key with me, a reminder of what I encountered. The whispers have stopped, but sometimes, just as I'm drifting off to sleep, I hear my name, softly, from the shadows. My name is Sarah, and I've always loved chocolate. So when a new shop called Choco Delights opened in town, I was one of the first to visit. The place was small and cozy, with shelves lined with handcrafted chocolates. The air was thick with the rich aroma of cocoa, making my mouth water. An elderly woman with sharp eyes stood behind the counter. She offered me a sample, a small, dark truffle wrapped in gold foil. "Try it," she urged with a thin smile. I took a bite, and the taste was extraordinary, sweet at first, then bitter with a strange metallic aftertaste. It was odd but addictive. I bought a box, eager to try more. That night, I couldn't resist. I ate one chocolate, then another, unable to stop. The taste grew stranger with each bite, the metallic flavor stronger, like blood. Suddenly, a sharp pain stabbed my stomach. I doubled over but dismissed it as overeating. The next morning, I woke up feeling nauseous, with a bitter taste lingering in my mouth. My reflection in the mirror startled me. My skin was pale, and dark circles framed my eyes. Despite feeling sick, I craved more chocolate. I grabbed another piece from the box, but the taste was different, off, rotten almost. I spat it out, but the craving didn't go away. I decided to return to the shop to complain, but when I arrived, the store was gone. The space was empty, as if it had never been there. Confused, I asked the bakery next door, but they insisted there hadn't been a chocolate shop in years. Panic set in as the pain in my stomach worsened, a sharp, twisting sensation that left me gasping. At home, the pain became unbearable. My stomach bulged unnaturally, and I felt something moving beneath the skin. Terrified, I grabbed a knife and made a small cut, hoping to relieve the pressure. Thick, dark liquid oozed out, followed by something small and hard, a tiny, perfectly formed chocolate truffle. I stared in horror as more chocolates pushed their way out, spilling onto the floor. I couldn't stop them, the pain and pressure growing with each writhing mass. My vision blurred, and I collapsed, surrounded by the sickly sweet scent of cocoa and the dark, glistening shapes that had once been my favorite treat. Now, every time I see chocolate, I feel a stab of fear. I still taste the bitterness, the metallic tang that reminds me of what's inside. I've sworn off sweets, but sometimes, late at night, I feel the faintest stir beneath my skin, as if the chocolates are still there, waiting to finish what they started.
My name is Mia, and there's a tree in my backyard that has haunted me since childhood. It's tall, twisted, and dead-looking, with gnarled branches that claw at the sky like skeletal fingers. My parents always told me to stay away from it, but they never explained why. They called it the crooked tree, and warned me that it was cursed. I thought they were just trying to scare me, but now I wish I had listened. When I was a kid, I used to stare at the tree from my bedroom window. It always seemed to lean closer to the house, even though it never moved. On windy nights, the branches would scrape against the window, making a sound like nails on glass. I would lie awake, terrified, convinced the tree was watching me. One summer, my curiosity got the better of me. I climbed out of my window and approached the tree. The air around it was colder, and the ground felt soft and damp under my feet. I reached out to touch the bark, but it was slick and warm, almost like skin. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my hand, and I pulled back to see a thin cut on my palm. The tree seemed to shudder, and I stumbled back, feeling dizzy and sick. After that night, strange things started happening. I'd wake up with scratches on my arms and legs, as if I'd been clawed in my sleep. My dreams were filled with the tree's twisted branches reaching for me, wrapping around my throat, pulling me into the earth. I tried to tell my parents, but they dismissed it as nightmares. The worst was when I noticed the tree had grown closer to the house. Each day it seemed to inch forward, its roots digging through the yard, dark and pulsing like veins. I watched in horror as it crept closer to my window, its shadow stretching across the walls of my room. One night, I woke up to find the branches pressed against the glass, scratching and tapping. The sound was relentless, like it was trying to get in. I shut the curtains, but the noise grew louder, filling my head until I couldn't take it anymore. I ran outside, desperate to make it stop. Standing before the tree, I felt an overwhelming urge to touch it again, as if it was calling to me. I reached out, and the branches wrapped around my arm, pulling me closer. I screamed, but no sound came out. The bark split open, revealing a dark, hollow space filled with writhing roots and something else, faces, twisted and screaming, trapped within the wood. I struggled, but the tree held me tight, its roots snaking around my legs, pulling me in. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was my reflection in the window, my face twisted in horror, just like the ones inside the tree. Now, the tree stands still, closer to the house than ever. My parents think I ran away, but I'm still here, trapped within the twisted bark, one more face among the others, screaming silently, forever part of the crooked tree.
My name is Mark Thompson. I found Duke, a stray German shepherd, wandering near my property on a foggy evening. He was scrawny, with matted fur and eyes that seemed to beg for help. I took him in, figuring I'd get him back on his feet and maybe find him a home. But something was off. Duke would often stare at walls, growling at nothing, and seemed to hear things I couldn't. Soon, strange noises began to echo through the house, soft whimpering around 3 a.m. At first, I thought it was Duke, but he was always asleep when it happened. The cries would seep through the walls, always coming from different corners, too quiet to trace. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds grew louder and more unsettling each night. One night, I woke to find Duke at the foot of my bed, staring at me. The whimpering was now a low wail coming from the hallway. Duke didn't move, just kept his eyes locked on me. I grabbed a flashlight, heart racing, and walked toward the sound. Duke followed silently. The hallway was colder than usual, and when I turned on the light, it flickered and went out. My flashlight revealed fresh claw marks on the floor. Duke whimpered again, but when I turned, he was gone. I swung the light back, and there, at the end of the hallway, was something hunched and twisted like a dog, but wrong. Its eyes glowed red, and around its neck hung Duke's collar. I stumbled back, slamming my door shut as the creature charged. It scratched and growled, rattling the door, then stopped suddenly. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, and Duke was back in his bed, seemingly asleep. The claw marks had vanished. The next day, Duke's collar was dirty, like it had been buried. I tried putting it on him, but he growled. That night, the whimpering returned, louder and closer, and the growling creature's presence felt more real. I've tried to leave Duke at shelters, far from home, but he always finds his way back. The whimpering never stops, and every night, I hear the creature's growl, and the scraping of claws gets closer. Duke isn't just a dog anymore. Whatever he brought with him, I don't think it's ever going to let us go.
My name is Claire Henderson, and I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. But what happened to me at Rose's beauty salon is something I can't explain, something that still haunts me to this day. It was a rainy evening when I first stepped inside Rose's. The salon had a reputation for being a bit of a local secret, known for its skilled stylists and tranquil atmosphere. As I entered, the dim lighting, soft hum of jazz music, and the faint scent of lavender created an almost dreamlike ambiance. I needed a change, something to shake off the weight of the past few months. The woman at the front desk greeted me with a smile. Her name was Rosa. Her appearance struck me immediately. Pale skin, unnaturally smooth, and her dark hair falling in perfect waves. She led me to a seat by the large mirror and asked what I was looking for. A trim, just a couple of inches off, I said, trying to shake off the slight unease I felt. She nodded, her eyes never quite meeting mine. As she draped the cape around me, I noticed the mirror was fogged slightly, which was strange given the lack of steam or heat in the room. It's just the humidity, I thought. Rosa moved with precision, her scissors gliding effortlessly through my hair. But something about her touch felt cold, almost too light. I glanced up into the mirror again, and that's when I noticed it. There were figures in the reflection. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the more I focused, the clearer they became. Shadows, faint outlines of people standing behind me, but when I turned my head, there was no one there. Just Rosa, calmly cutting my hair. I swallowed hard and asked, "Do you see that?" Rosa didn't pause or respond. Her focus was entirely on the scissors, snipping rhythmically. My pulse quickened, and I couldn't shake the sensation that something or someone was watching me. Minutes passed in silence until I felt an odd pressure on my scalp. Not the gentle tug of hair being cut, but a heavy pressing weight. I winced and opened my mouth to speak, but Rosa beat me to it. "Almost done, Claire," she said softly, her voice low and soothing, as if she knew I was growing uneasy. But that wasn't the strangest part. I hadn't told her my name. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. How do you know my name?" She finally stopped, placing the scissors on the counter, her eyes meeting mine in the mirror. Her reflection, it wasn't her anymore. The face staring back at me was gaunt, hollowed, as if the very life had been drained from it. Her eyes were dark, endless pits of black, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "I know a lot about you," she whispered. I jolted out of the chair, the cape sliding off me as I backed away. But the moment I moved, the salon around me seemed to shift. The lights flickered, and the shadows in the mirror grew darker, more defined. I could see them now. Figures of women all sitting in the chairs behind me, their faces pale, their eyes wide and lifeless. The door. Where was the door? I turned, searching for the exit, but all I saw were more mirrors, more reflections of me standing there in panic. I could feel my breath quickening, the room closing in. Rosa stepped closer, her feet barely making a sound on the floor. "You're not the first to come here for a change," she said softly, her voice echoing unnaturally in the room. "But once you sit in my chair, you never leave." I ran, bolting toward what I thought was the front of the salon, but the mirrors distorted everything, twisting the space into an endless maze. My reflection was everywhere, trapped in every angle, looking just as terrified as I felt. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sensation of cold hands wrapping around my shoulders and that awful ghostly smile of Rosa's fading into the darkness. When I woke up, I was lying outside the salon, drenched in rain, my hair perfectly trimmed. The windows of Rosa's beauty salon were dark, the place boarded up, as if it had been abandoned for years. But every time I pass by that place now, I still see myself in the reflection of the broken windows, staring back at me, trapped inside that nightmare forever.
My name is Ethan Hayes, and I never thought a bottle of whiskey could turn my life into a nightmare. It all started on a cold, rainy night when I stumbled upon an old whiskey shop, Kane's Spirits, on a forgotten corner of the city. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of oak and aged liquor, and rows of dusty bottles lined the dimly lit shelves. An old man with sunken eyes stood behind the counter, his smile unsettling. Looking for something special, he asked, his voice dry and raspy. My eyes were drawn to a bottle on the top shelf. It was thick, almost black, with a faded label that read, "The Devil's Share." "What's that one?" I asked. The old man's smile faltered. "That's a rare one. Legend says it's cursed. Those who drink it see things better left unseen." I laughed it off and bought the bottle anyway, dismissing his warning to never finish it. Back home, I poured myself a glass. The whiskey was unlike anything I'd ever tasted, smooth, with a dark, smoky edge. As I drank, a strange warmth spread through me, but soon the shadows in my apartment began to flicker and stretch. I blinked, convinced it was just the alcohol, but the room warped and the walls seemed to pulse like they were alive. Figures emerged from the darkness, pale, hollow-eyed faces whispering in a language I couldn't understand. I dropped the glass, but they didn't disappear. They moved closer, their fingers reaching for me. I splashed water on my face, but the reflection in the mirror wasn't mine, it was the old man from the shop, his eyes empty black voids. Panicking, I tried to get rid of the bottle. I poured the whiskey down the drain, but no matter what I did, it always reappeared, full as ever. The figures haunted me day and night, their whispers growing louder, echoing even in the daylight. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, they were there, watching. I couldn't resist the urge to drink. Last night, I poured one final glass, hoping to end the torment. As the liquid passed my lips, the figures reappeared, screaming instead of whispering. The room spun, walls bled, and my vision darkened. Now, as I write this, I feel them closing in. The bottle is empty, and I know I've made a grave mistake. The old man's warning echoes in my mind, too late to save me. My name is Ethan Hayes, and I know tonight will be my last. The devil's share has claimed me. If you ever see that cursed bottle, do yourself a favor, leave it on the shelf. And whatever you do, never finish the bottle.
My name is Rachel, and I used to love my nightly walks. The quiet streets and cool breeze helped clear my mind. But that changed last month, on a night I'll never forget. I was walking down my usual route when I noticed a street light flickering up ahead. It was odd. This particular lamp always seemed to have issues, constantly blinking like it was trying to communicate. That night, though, it was worse. The light would go out entirely, plunging the street into darkness, only to flash back on moments later. I quickened my pace, feeling an unexplainable sense of dread. As I passed under the faulty light, it buzzed louder, almost like a warning. The darkness felt oppressive, and when the light flickered on again, I saw it, a shadowy figure at the edge of the illuminated circle, just outside of the light's reach. It didn't move, just stood there, as if waiting for something. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the flickering light, but my gut told me to keep walking. As I hurried away, the next streetlight went out. Then the next. One by one, the lights blinked off in a sequence, chasing me down the street. My heart pounded in my chest as I broke into a sprint, trying to outrun the darkness that seemed to be creeping up on me. I stopped under the last functioning streetlight on the block, panting and looking back. The figure was closer now, standing right at the edge of the darkness, just outside the light's reach. It was tall and thin, its form shifting like smoke, features indistinguishable. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but the screen was dead, just like the lights. The figure stepped closer, just a hair's breadth away from the light's boundary. The street light buzzed again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't just flickering, it was struggling, like it was fighting against whatever was out there. I could see the darkness shifting, almost alive, writhing and pulsing like a living thing. I backed up, but the streetlights started to dim, the buzzing growing more frantic. The figure edged closer, its shape more defined now, long limbs, a head that seemed to tilt in curiosity or malice. I reached the edge of the light, and the buzzing stopped. The streetlight went out. I froze, swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Cold, empty, like the air had been sucked out of the space around me. I stumbled forward, trying to find the light again, but there was nothing. Just the darkness and the quiet, and the sound of footsteps that weren't mine. I never made it home that night. They found my phone and my keys, but I was gone, lost somewhere in that stretch of street where the lights always flickered. They say the street lights are working fine now, but some nights, if you walk by, you might see one flicker and buzz. And if you do, don't stop. Don't look back, just keep walking. Because something is out there, waiting in the dark.
My name is Alex, and I've always been a gamer, spending hours lost in virtual worlds. But last week, I found an online game I wish I'd never played, a game called Eclipse. I discovered it on a forum, through a sketchy link. The post promised an experience that transcends reality, and my curiosity got the better of me. I downloaded it, ignoring all the warning signs, unverified sources, no reviews. The game opened with a simple black screen, "Welcome to Eclipse." Press start. I hit start, and my screen flickered, loading a character creation screen that was eerily realistic. I created my character, but it looked exactly like me, down to the smallest detail. I felt uneasy, but brushed it off as advanced tech. The game world was a dark, sprawling city shrouded in perpetual night. The objective was simple: survive. No instructions, just a ticking clock in the corner of the screen. I started exploring empty streets and abandoned buildings. The silence was oppressive, no NPCs, no players, just me and shadows that shifted when I wasn't looking. Then, my screen glitched. For a split second, I saw my reflection in the game, but it was more than a reflection. My character was staring directly at me, eyes wide with terror. I blinked, and the game continued as if nothing had happened. I heard faint whispers through my headset, just on the edge of perception, growing louder the deeper I ventured into the city. They weren't just game sounds, they were real. I could hear my name, faint and distorted, mixed with static. I tried to exit, but the game wouldn't respond. My character started moving on its own, sprinting through the city as if being chased. I lost all control, the game was dragging me along. The screen went black, but the whispers didn't stop. The game loaded again, and I was in a room identical to mine, same desk, same walls. My character was at the computer, mirroring my every move. Then, the screen flickered, and a figure appeared behind my character, just out of reach. Its face was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes were cold and empty, staring directly at me. I whipped around, but my room was empty. When I looked back, the figure was closer, almost touching my character's shoulder. I tried to shut down my computer, but nothing worked. The whispers turned into frantic typing, filling my screen with the words, "You can't leave." The monitor went dark, and the room fell silent. I yanked the power cord, heart pounding. When I rebooted, Eclipse was gone, no files, no trace, like it never existed. But the whispers haven't stopped. Sometimes, I see flickers in my peripherals, and my reflection in screens lingers too long. If you ever see a game called Eclipse, don't download it. Because once you start, it never really ends.
My name is Clara, and last month I moved into a new apartment. It was nothing special, just a small space with creaky floors and dim lighting, but it was mine. The only thing missing was a sofa, so I started browsing online. That's when I found an ad for a local sofa maker named Joseph's Custom Sofas. The reviews were glowing, praising his craftsmanship and attention to detail. The prices were cheap, almost too good to be true, but I ignored the uneasy feeling in my gut and decided to order. I arrived at Joseph's workshop the next day. It was tucked away in an old industrial district, a place that looked forgotten by time. The shop was dimly lit, filled with the smell of sawdust and varnish. Fabrics of every color and texture hung from the walls, and half-finished sofas cluttered the floor. Joseph himself was a wiry man in his 60s, with piercing blue eyes and hands that looked far too steady for his age. "Looking for something special?" he asked, his voice oddly warm. "I need a sofa," I said, glancing around. "Something unique." He smiled, showing too many teeth. "I have just the thing. Follow me." He led me to the back of the shop, where a beautiful vintage-looking sofa sat. Its deep blue fabric looked rich and inviting, and the woodwork was intricate, almost artistic. I ran my fingers along the armrest, admiring the craftsmanship. "It's perfect," I said. "How much?" Joseph gave me a price that seemed ridiculously low. I didn't question it. I just paid and arranged for delivery. The sofa arrived the next day. It fit perfectly in my living room, and I couldn't wait to relax on it. But as the days went by, I noticed strange things. At night, I'd hear soft creaks as if someone was shifting on the sofa. Once, I found deep indents in the cushions, like someone had been sitting there. I brushed it off as settling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. Then, the nightmare started. Every night, I'd dream of being trapped in a small, dark space, unable to move or breathe. The walls would close in, and I'd hear faint whispers, pleading and desperate. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, only to find the sofa looking as perfect as ever, as if mocking me. One evening, as I was cleaning, I noticed something odd under the sofa, a seam that didn't belong. I pulled at it, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold, an old, faded photo of a young woman sitting on the exact same sofa, looking eerily like me. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression was one of sheer terror. I confronted Joseph the next day, but his shop was gone, completely cleared out, like it had never existed. I called the number from the ad, but it was disconnected. Panicking, I researched more about his business and stumbled upon a forum thread about missing people, all linked to Joseph's Custom Sofas. The thread claimed Joseph was a collector, not of antiques, but of souls. He would craft his sofas using cursed materials, trapping the spirits of his victims inside. Terrified, I rushed home to get rid of the sofa, but it was too late. The whispers were louder now, and the indents on the cushions deeper. I tried to drag it to the curb, but the fabric seemed to cling to my hands, and the whispers turned into screams. Now I can't sleep. I can't escape the feeling that someone is watching me, waiting. I've moved the sofa to the basement, but I can still hear it creak at night, the faint sound of desperate souls trying to break free. My name is Clara, and if you ever come across a sofa that seems too perfect, too inviting, don't sit on it. Don't bring it into your home. Because once you do, it might never let you go.
My name is Sam, and I never imagined a simple childhood game could turn into a nightmare. It all began when I found an old board game in my grandparents' attic called Donkey Flight. The box was dusty, and the cover featured a cartoonish donkey with wings soaring through a bright, whimsical sky. The instructions were faded, but it promised a fun adventure for up to 4 players. Curious, I decided to play it with my friends, Mark, Lucy, and Jenna. We gathered in my living room one evening, spread the game board out on the floor, and read the instructions. The rules seemed harmless. Roll the dice, move your piece, and follow the quirky challenges. The goal was to navigate through the board and reach the Sky Castle first. At first, everything was lighthearted. We laughed as we navigated through silly obstacles like the Rainbow Swamp and the floating clouds. But as we progressed, something strange began to happen. The room grew colder, and the cheerful music on the game's old record player seemed to warp and distort. The dice rolls felt off, and the game pieces moved on their own accord, often landing us on spaces that sent us back to the start. We laughed nervously, thinking it was just a poorly designed game. But then, Jenna landed on a space marked The Dark Descent. Suddenly, the room's lights flickered, and the cheerful donkey on the board seemed to scowl. The temperature dropped even further, and a chilling draft swept through the room. Jenna went to the kitchen to get some snacks, but she never returned. Mark and Lucy went to look for her, but they found nothing. No sign of Jenna, just an empty, dark kitchen. We searched the house frantically, but Jenna was gone. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. We returned to the living room, desperate to understand what was happening. The game board had changed. The spaces were now marked with ominous symbols, and the cheerful donkey had transformed into a sinister, grinning creature. The instructions on the board had changed too. To escape, reach the Sky Castle, or face the curse. Panic set in. Mark and Lucy wanted to abandon the game, but I insisted we finish it, hoping it might undo whatever had happened. We played on, but the game seemed to fight us. Every roll of the dice sent us backward. Every attempt to reach the Sky Castle met with new, terrifying obstacles. Shadows danced on the walls, and the room grew colder with every move. Finally, as we neared the end, the board's darkness seemed to close in on us. The grinning donkey on the board seemed to mock our efforts. I could hear Jenna's faint, desperate cries coming from somewhere, but I couldn't tell where. Mark and Lucy were frozen in fear, their eyes wide with terror. When I finally rolled the dice to land on the final space, the game board erupted in a blinding light. I felt a force pulling me, dragging me toward the board. The room spun, and for a moment I thought I would be sucked into the game itself. Then everything stopped. The board fell silent, the lights returned to normal, and the game was back to its original state. Jenna was still missing, and Mark and Lucy were in a state of shock. We never found Jenna again, and after that night, we couldn't bring ourselves to touch the game. To this day, I keep the Donkey Flight board locked away in the attic, untouched. I don't know what happened to Jenna or why the game changed, but every so often I hear strange noises coming from the attic, a faint, eerie whistling, as if a donkey is flying through the darkness. My name is Sam, and if you ever come across a game called Donkey Flight, do yourself a favor and leave it alone. Some games are better left forgotten, and some flights should never be taken.
My name is Daniel, and I never believed in ghosts until I boarded the Titanic. It was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a luxury cruise recreating the infamous voyage. The ship was modeled after the original Titanic, with every detail meticulously crafted. But as soon as I stepped aboard, something felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an eerie stillness. The first few days passed like any normal cruise, but on the 4th night, things changed. I couldn't sleep. My room was freezing, far colder than it should have been. I wandered the halls, hoping to clear my head. The ship was silent, eerily so, with only the distant hum of the engines breaking the quiet. As I passed by one of the grand staircases, I saw her, a woman dressed in an old-fashioned gown, standing at the top. She was looking out into the distance, her face pale and expressionless. I blinked, and she was gone. My pulse quickened. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. The next night, it got worse. I was lying in bed when I heard it. Faint music. It sounded like a string quartet playing a mournful tune. But it was the middle of the night, and the halls were empty. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The music led me to the grand ballroom. The room was filled with people, all dressed in clothing from 1912. They danced, laughed, and drank as if it were a normal evening. But their faces were wrong. Pale, lifeless, their eyes hollow and vacant. They were ghosts, spirits trapped in the final moments before the ship's disaster. I stumbled back, horrified, but no one seemed to notice me. The music continued, growing louder, more frantic. I could feel the ship tilting beneath me, just slightly at first, then more pronounced. Water dripped from the walls, and the temperature dropped even further. I ran, desperate to escape. But no matter where I went, I heard the voices, the screams, the splashing water, the terror of those final moments from over a century ago. I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, but the icy water that began seeping through the floors told me otherwise. On the last night of the voyage, I woke to the sound of rushing water. My room was flooding. I threw open the door, but the hallway was submerged. Panic gripped me as I fought to find an escape route. I made it to the deck, and that's when I saw it. The ocean was calm, the stars bright above, but the original Titanic was there. Half sunken, broken in half, and shrouded in fog. The dead walked the decks, their faces twisted in pain, calling for help, their voices drowning in the cold night air. I don't know how I made it through the rest of that night. I don't know if anyone else saw what I did, or if they even believed me, but the Titanic never sank. Not completely. It's still out there, drifting through the icy waters, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. And I'll never forget the faces of those who are still waiting for the final plunge.
My name is Ethan Mills, and I'll never forget the night I took that cursed subway. It still haunts me. It was late, and I missed the last bus. I had no choice but to take the subway. The platform was deserted, save for a flickering light that buzzed above. The train arrived silently, no screeching brakes, no rumble, just there. The doors slid open, and I hesitated. The car was empty, no conductor, no passengers, but I stepped in. Exhausted, I slumped into a seat as the train lurched forward. I glanced at the display screen to check the upcoming stops. It was blank. No station names, just static. Suddenly, the train slowed. It stopped at a station I didn't recognize. The sign on the wall was broken, but I could make out part of it, something gate. The air smelled like decay. As I peered out onto the platform, my heart sank. There was someone standing in the far corner. The figure was tall and still. I couldn't see a face, just a shadowy silhouette. As I stared, it took a slow step toward the train. My pulse quickened. The doors started closing, and I backed away, watching the figure inch closer. Before the doors shut, I caught a glimpse of its face, empty, hollow eyes in a pale face. The train jerked forward, leaving the station behind. I sat down, shaking. What the hell was that? My mind tried to rationalize it, but unease gnawed at me. And then the lights flickered. The flickering grew more intense. With each burst of darkness, the temperature in the car dropped. I heard breathing. It wasn't mine. It was slow and raspy. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and in the dark, I felt them, figures surrounding me, pressing in. A voice whispered, "Join us." I swung around, but no one was there. The lights blinked back on, and I was alone again, but the air was thick with something I couldn't see. I needed to get off. The train slowed again, and the doors hissed open. I bolted, stumbling onto the platform. But there was no exit. Just an empty, endless platform stretching into darkness. Behind me, the train hadn't left. Its doors remained open, as if waiting for me to return. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate. I turned, but saw nothing. The train doors finally slid shut, and it disappeared into the tunnel. I was left alone in the cold, silent darkness, with only those footsteps behind me. I never took that subway line again. Now I walk, no matter how late it is. Because I know if I ever get on that train again, I might never come back.
My name is Sarah, and I wish I'd never come back to campus for homecoming. It had been 5 years since I graduated from Hollowbrook University. I was excited to reunite with my friends, relive old memories, and attend the big homecoming party. The campus looked the same as it always had: sprawling ivy-covered buildings, towering oak trees, and the familiar cobblestone paths. But something about it felt different. Darker somehow. The party was being held in the old gymnasium, the same place where all the major events had been back when I was a student. But as I approached the building that night, the air around it felt thick, heavy with an unexplainable tension. The once lively campus now seemed empty, hollow. My friends joked about the old curse of Hollowbrook, how the gym was built on the remains of an ancient burial ground. We laughed it off, just like old times. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease settling in. As soon as we stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The gym was packed with people, but the air was stifling and cold, the lights flickering ever so slightly, the music blared, and the crowd was lively, but there was something off about the energy. It was as though the room was filled with a dark, unseen presence, lurking just beneath the surface. Then it started. One of my friends, Amy, disappeared. We all assumed she just wandered off to get drinks or meet someone, but as time passed, she didn't come back. We split up to search for her, and that's when things got truly terrifying. The farther I walked from the crowd, the darker the gym seemed to become. The music faded, replaced by whispers, faint at first, then louder. I turned down a hallway, and the whispers turned to sobs. A chill ran down my spine. At the end of the corridor, I saw her, Amy, standing with her back to me. "Amy?" I called out. She didn't move. My heart raced as I approached her, reaching out. When I touched her shoulder, she turned. Her face was blank, expressionless, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth opened, but no words came out, just the soft, echoing whisper of voices that didn't belong to her. Before I could react, she collapsed to the ground, and I stumbled back in horror. I ran back to the main hall, but it wasn't the same anymore. The gym, once filled with partygoers, was almost empty. The few people left had the same blank, hollow expressions as Amy. They moved slowly, like they were trapped in some kind of trance. My phone buzzed. A text from one of my other friends: "Get out now. Don't look back." I didn't hesitate. I sprinted toward the exit, heart pounding, the whispers growing louder with each step. As I reached the doors, I dared a glance behind me. The gym was now completely dark, but there were shapes, shadowy figures, emerging from the corners of the room, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I burst through the doors into the night air, gasping, shaking. My phone buzzed again. Another message: "It's the curse. Don't come back." I never did. None of us from that night ever returned to Hollowbrook. No one talks about what happened at that homecoming. I hear rumors, though, about how the university denies anything strange happened, about how more students have disappeared since then. Whatever haunts that campus, it's still there, and it's waiting.
My name is Emma, and I wish I'd never opened that suitcase. I had just moved into a small, old apartment. It wasn't much, but it was cheap. The landlord warned me about the basement, full of junk left by former tenants. Of course, curiosity got the better of me one day. The basement was dark and smelled of mildew. Among the piles of forgotten belongings, a small, battered suitcase caught my eye. It was covered in dirt, as though it had been abandoned for decades. Something about it drew me in, despite the warning in the back of my mind. I opened it and inside were old clothes and at the bottom, a strange, cracked doll. Its eyes were wide and glassy, staring up at me. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off. Next to the doll was an old photograph, a family of 3. The little girl in the photo looked just like the doll. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft creaks outside my bedroom door. The apartment was old, so I tried to ignore it. But the noises got louder, like footsteps. I got up to check, nothing. The place was empty. The next day, things got worse. Lights flickered constantly, and objects moved. I'd place something down, and moments later, it would be on the floor or across the room. The air grew colder. Then, I noticed the doll sitting on my living room table. I hadn't brought it up from the basement. I threw the doll and suitcase away, but that night, I woke up to the sound of giggling. The room was pitch black, but I felt something watching me. When I turned on the light, the doll was at the foot of my bed, its cracked face smiling. Terrified, I grabbed it and rushed to the basement. I shoved it back into the suitcase and left it in the farthest corner. As I turned to leave, I saw her, the little girl from the photograph. She stood at the top of the stairs, watching me, her eyes filled with anger. I woke up in my apartment, unsure how I'd gotten back. The suitcase and doll were gone, but I knew they weren't really gone. I moved out the next day, but every night since, I hear those same creaks outside my door and the faint sound of giggling. The suitcase isn't done with me yet.
My name is Marco, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the local pizza baker. People in town love my pies, the secret recipes handed down through my family for generations. But lately, things have changed. I'm not sure how or when it started, but there's a strange, cold feeling that's settled over my pizzeria. Something isn't right. It was late one night, long after I'd closed up shop. The streets outside were quiet, too quiet. I was cleaning up the kitchen, scraping the last bits of flour from the counter, when the bell above the front door jingled. I froze. No one should have been there. I walked to the front, expecting maybe a lost customer or some drunk stumbling in, but no one was there. The door was wide open, the cold night air creeping in. I shut the door and locked it again, double-checking this time. But as I turned around, something caught my eye. There, in the middle of one of the empty tables, was a pizza box. I hadn't made any deliveries that night, nor had anyone picked up an order. My hands trembled as I walked over and lifted the lid. Inside there was a single slice of pizza, but it wasn't any pizza I recognized. The cheese bubbled unnaturally, and the pepperoni, it wasn't pepperoni. It was something else. It almost looked like pieces of flesh. My stomach turned, and the scent that wafted up from the box was sour, rotten. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The kitchen door creaked open, even though I knew it was locked. The smell grew stronger, almost unbearable now. I stepped back, my heart racing. That's when I saw him. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway of the kitchen, its face hidden in the dark. "Marco," a voice rasped, low and broken. I staggered back, dropping the box. Who are you?" My voice shook as much as my hands. The figure stepped into the light, and I nearly collapsed. It was my father. But not the father I knew. His skin was pale, eyes sunken deep into his skull, lips pulled back into a grotesque smile. He had been dead for years. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice crawling over my skin like spiders. "You left us, Marco, and now you'll join us." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I stumbled backward as he came closer. The smell of decay clung to him, stronger with every step. My back hit the wall, and I knew I had nowhere to run. Suddenly, the room filled with the sound of dozens of voices whispering in unison, chanting my name, calling me home. I shut my eyes tight, trying to block it all out, praying that this was just some nightmare. But when I opened them again, my father was inches from my face, his cold breath on my skin. "Time to finish the recipe," he whispered. I screamed, bolting for the door, throwing it open and running out into the street. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, slamming the door behind me, locking it and collapsing on the floor. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. The next morning I returned to the pizzeria. The box was gone. The door was locked, just as I'd left it. Everything seemed normal, but I know it wasn't. That night, when I went to close up again, the box was back, and inside, another slice waited. This time, it had my name carved into it. I can't escape. The voices keep calling. The faces in the shadows, they watch me. And the worst part, every night the pizza slices grow more familiar. They're coming for me, one slice at a time.
It was a hot summer, and my Uncle Jack had just come back to town after being away for years. He wasn't the same man I remembered. There was something off about him, something lurking beneath his smile. But what really stood out was his chips. He had always been a bit of a chef, experimenting with different recipes, but these chips, there was something different about them. They were golden, crispy, and smelled like heaven. He said they were his secret recipe, something he perfected while he was away. Everyone in the neighborhood was obsessed. My friends couldn't stop talking about them. The town's little store could barely keep up with the demand. It wasn't long before I got curious. I mean, they were just chips, right? How could a snack stir up so much excitement? So one evening, I asked my uncle if I could watch him make a batch. He hesitated at first, his usual smile fading for a moment before it crept back, stretched tight across his face. "All right, kiddo, you can help me tonight," he said, his voice a little too cheerful. Later that night, I found myself in his kitchen, the air thick with the smell of oil and frying potatoes. He handed me a knife and gestured to a sack of potatoes sitting by the counter. I started slicing, but something about the texture of the potatoes felt strange. They were soft, almost fleshy, and had a weird, faint odor, nothing like the fresh ones we usually had. I glanced at my uncle, who was busy stirring a pot of boiling oil, humming an odd, unfamiliar tune. "Where do you get these potatoes, Uncle Jack?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to me slowly, his eyes glinting in the dim light of the kitchen. "They're special," he finally said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Not from around here. You could say I found them abroad." His words sent a chill down my spine. Abroad? He hadn't mentioned where he'd been for the past few years, and now I wondered if I really wanted to know. As I sliced deeper into the potatoes, I noticed something horrifying. There, embedded in the center of one of the pieces, was something that looked like a fingernail. My stomach turned. I dropped the knife and took a step back, staring at the pile of potatoes in front of me. There were more, bits of hair, small bones, and chunks that looked far too much like skin. "Uncle, what is this?" My voice cracked as I backed away. He didn't look surprised. In fact, he smiled wider, his teeth showing now, unnervingly sharp. "I told you they're special. You wanted to know the secret, didn't you?" I tried to bolt for the door, but Uncle Jack was faster than I expected. His grip on my arm was cold, his fingers pressing into my skin like a vice. "You'll understand soon enough," he whispered, dragging me toward the pot of bubbling oil. The smell was overpowering now, sickly sweet and rancid, nothing like the delicious aroma from earlier. I kicked and fought, but he was too strong. He forced me closer to the pot, his voice in my ear, chanting some words I couldn't understand. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the shiny surface of the oil, my face pale and terrified. And then, just as my head was inches from the scalding oil, everything went black. When I woke up, I was alone in the kitchen. The pot was empty, and the counters were spotless. No sign of the horrifying things I'd seen. I staggered to my feet and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was far, far away. The next day, the entire town was still buzzing about Uncle Jack's chips. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Who would believe me? But one thing was certain. No matter how popular those chips were, I would never eat them again. And neither should anyone else. But the worst part? Uncle Jack's chips are everywhere now. He's opened up shops in nearby towns. People can't get enough. They're obsessed. And every time I pass one of his stores, I hear the same whispering chant in my head that I heard in his kitchen that night. They're not potatoes. They're something else.
It all started when I found the notebook at a yard sale. It wasn't anything special, just a plain black leather-bound book, the kind you'd see in any stationery store. But something about it called to me. It was buried under a pile of old, dusty books, forgotten. The moment I touched it, I felt a strange chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. The seller, an old woman with gray hair and hollow eyes, gave me a look when I brought it to her. "That notebook belonged to someone long gone," she said, her voice gravely. "Be careful what you write in it." I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to make the sale sound mysterious. I paid her, tossed the notebook in my bag, and forgot about it for a few days. One night, after a particularly stressful day at work, I found myself pulling the notebook out of my bag. I had always enjoyed journaling, and something about writing out my thoughts calmed me down. I opened the first page and found it blank, the paper unusually smooth beneath my fingertips. Grabbing a pen, I wrote a simple sentence: "I wish I didn't have to go to work tomorrow." I sighed, closed the notebook, and went to bed, not thinking anything of it. The next morning, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my boss. "Office closed for the day due to a power outage. Enjoy your day off." I was stunned. It was exactly what I had written in the notebook. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but curiosity gnawed at me. That night, I tested it again. I opened the notebook and wrote, "I hope it rains tomorrow." The next day, clouds rolled in, and by afternoon, it was pouring. The chill I'd felt when I first touched the notebook crept back in, but now it was mixed with excitement. What was this thing? Could it really make my wishes come true? Over the next few days, I began to test its limits. I wrote small, harmless things, wishing for a good meal, for my favorite show to be on TV. Each time, it happened just as I wrote. But I couldn't stop there. The power was intoxicating, and soon, I was writing bigger wishes. That's when things started to go wrong. One night, drunk on the idea of control, I wrote something I never should have. "I wish my neighbor would disappear." She was always so loud, always slamming doors and playing music late at night. I didn't mean it, at least not entirely. It was just frustration. But the next morning, she was gone. Her apartment was empty, like she had never even lived there. The landlord said she moved out in the middle of the night, no notice, no forwarding address. But I knew the truth. The notebook had made her disappear. Panic set in. I tried to stop using the notebook to hide it away, but the temptation was always there. The power was too great. I started to fear what it could do, and more importantly, what I had done. The weight of my neighbor's disappearance hung over me like a dark cloud. One evening, while I was trying to resist the urge to write in the notebook, I noticed something strange. The pages I had written in before were no longer blank. Instead, they were filled with tiny, spidery handwriting that wasn't mine. It was a list of names, people I had never heard of, and next to each name, a date. Horrified, I realized the dates were the exact days I had written my wishes. My neighbor's name was on the list, too. I grabbed the notebook, determined to destroy it. But no matter what I did, tearing it, burning it, soaking it in water, the notebook remained intact. It was as if it was indestructible, its power unbreakable. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, haunted by the thought of the notebook. Eventually, I gave in, opening it once more. I didn't want to write anything, but something in me, or in the notebook, forced my hand. My fingers trembled as I wrote, "I wish I never found this notebook." I snapped the notebook shut and threw it into a drawer, hoping it would all just stop. But when I woke up the next morning, nothing had changed. The notebook was still there, and its pages were filled with more names. Names of people I didn't know, people who were gone. And then, at the bottom of the list, I saw my own name. The date next to it? Today. I dropped the notebook, heart pounding. But it was too late. The room grew cold, and I could feel something watching me closing in. My fate had been written.
My name's Evan, and I've been a paramedic for 6 years. In that time, I've seen a lot of things that would make most people lose sleep. But there's one call I'll never forget, one ride that changed everything. It was a quiet night, unusually so. My partner Sarah and I were parked in our usual spot, waiting for dispatch. We hadn't had a call for hours, and the city streets were eerily empty, save for the occasional car passing by. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. Unit 17, we've got a 1045, possible cardiac arrest, 112 Riverton Avenue. Respond immediately. We flipped the lights on and sped through the streets. Riverton Avenue wasn't far, but it was in a part of town I wasn't familiar with. When we arrived, the house looked abandoned, old, with boarded-up windows and a front yard overgrown with weeds. Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. No one in the neighborhood seemed to be around, and there was no sign of anyone waiting outside. We grabbed our gear and made our way to the front door. I knocked, but there was no answer. The air was thick, and every instinct I had told me something was off. Sarah tried the door. It creaked open, revealing a dark, musty hallway. "Hello?" I called out, but only silence greeted us. We stepped inside cautiously, our flashlights slicing through the darkness. The house smelled old, like it hadn't been lived in for years. There was no furniture, no pictures on the walls, just dust and decay. Then we heard it, a soft, faint voice coming from upstairs. It was barely audible, but it sounded like someone calling for help. "Let's go," Sarah said, leading the way. The stairs creaked beneath our weight as we ascended, our footsteps echoing through the empty house. When we reached the top, we found a long, dark hallway lined with closed doors. The voice was clearer now, but it didn't sound quite right. It was distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away. We approached the door at the end of the hall, where the sound seemed to be coming from. I knocked again, my heart pounding in my chest. "Paramedics," I called out. "We're here to help." No answer. I pushed the door open, and what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the middle of the room, was an old hospital gurney. On it lay a man, pale, motionless, with eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. He wasn't breathing. His skin had the grayish hue of someone long gone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the ambulance sitting just outside the window. Our ambulance. Except we hadn't parked it there. Sarah and I froze. How could it be outside when we had parked in front? And why was the engine still running? The lights weren't flashing, but the unmistakable hum of the engine filled the room. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced. Something was horribly wrong. But before I could think, the man on the gurney blinked. I jumped back, nearly dropping my flashlight. He blinked again, slowly, and then his mouth opened, but no sound came out. His eyes rolled toward me, wide and filled with something I couldn't describe. Fear, despair, anger, whatever it was, it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the radio on my belt crackled. I fumbled to answer it, desperate for some explanation. "Unit 17, what's your location? We lost GPS on you. Are you responding to the call?" I froze. I brought the radio to my mouth and stammered, "We're at 112 Riverton Avenue. We're here." There was a pause, and then the dispatcher's voice came back, more confused than before. "There's no 112 Riverton Avenue on file. Are you sure about the address?" I looked at Sarah, panic rising in my chest. We were standing in the house. The address had been clear. But now, it didn't exist? "We need to get out of here," Sarah muttered, backing away from the gurney. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us. The room plunged into darkness, the only light now coming from the ambulance's headlights outside the window. We rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Something, or someone, was keeping us inside. And then we heard it, the siren. That low, mournful wail of an ambulance on the move, except this one was coming closer. The engine revved, the sound growing louder, and I swear I could feel the vibration in the floor beneath my feet. I turned toward the window, watching as the ambulance slowly backed away, leaving us behind. The man on the gurney began to move, sitting up, his bones creaking with unnatural stiffness. His eyes never left us. He whispered something under his breath, and though I couldn't make out the words, it felt like a warning. I don't remember how we got out of that house. One moment we were trapped, the next we were running down the stairs and out into the street, gasping for air. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent, as if it had swallowed whatever nightmare lived inside. But the ambulance was gone. Sarah and I never spoke about that night again. We didn't tell anyone. And since then, I've made sure to avoid Riverton Avenue. It's not on any map, anyway. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the wail of an ambulance siren in the distance. And I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, looking for its next passenger.
My name's Mike, and this happened when I was about 16, way past the target audience for Ben 10. But I didn't care. I grew up watching the show, and there was something about the aliens, the adventures, and the Omnitrix that brought me comfort. So when I found out one of the local TV channels was airing a marathon of Ben 10 episodes late one night, I couldn't resist. I grabbed some snacks, settled onto the couch, and turned on the TV. It was just like old times, but a bit off. There was static before the channel loaded, and the picture seemed slightly distorted, like the signal wasn't coming in right. I ignored it, thinking it was just the TV or the network having issues. After all, this was an old series, reruns from who knows where. As the show started, everything seemed normal. Ben was running from some alien bad guy, Gwen was making her usual sarcastic comments, and Grandpa Max was driving the rust bucket. But then something strange happened during the transformation sequence, when Ben hit the Omnitrix. The usual green glow turned red. I hadn't seen that before. The screen flickered, and Ben's alien transformation froze for a second, like the video was glitching. Then the image shifted. It was no longer Ben turning into one of his usual aliens. His body warped into something grotesque, an alien I didn't recognize. This thing was tall, lanky, and covered in scales. Its eyes were hollow, glowing a sickly white, and its mouth was wide open, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It let out this horrible screech that sent chills down my spine. The sound wasn't like anything from the show. It was too real, like a scream pulled from somewhere deep. I figured it was some kind of rare episode I hadn't seen before, maybe one of the reboots I missed. I mean, Ben 10 had a lot of versions over the years, but something about it felt wrong. The episode wasn't following the usual formula. There was no humor, no banter, just silence, punctuated by the aliens' screeches and distorted audio. As I kept watching, the scenes got darker. The rust bucket was driving through what looked like an empty, desolate wasteland instead of the usual sunny settings. Ben didn't seem like himself either. He looked scared, confused, like he was trying to fix the Omnitrix but couldn't. Every time he tried, the red glow came back and the same twisted, horrifying alien appeared. Suddenly, the TV glitched again. The screen went black for a moment before flashing back on, and now Ben was staring directly at the screen. His eyes looked real. Not animated, not part of the cartoon. Real. And he wasn't smiling or making a goofy face. He looked terrified. His eyes darted from side to side as if he could see something I couldn't. Then, without warning, he spoke. Not the way cartoon characters speak, though. His voice was shaky, trembling, and it felt like he was speaking to me. "Why are you watching this?" Ben asked, his voice low and scared. I froze. What did he just say? I turned the volume down, thinking I misheard him. But no, his eyes were still fixed on me, and he repeated the question, this time louder. "Why are you still watching?" The screen flickered again, and the red Omnitrix glow returned. This time it filled the entire screen, and Ben was gone. All that remained was the sound of heavy breathing, like something was standing right behind me, watching me watch the show. I grabbed the remote and hit the power button, but the TV didn't turn off. The breathing grew louder, and now I could hear whispers too, faint, unintelligible voices speaking directly into my ear, though I was the only one in the room. Panicked, I yanked the plug from the wall, finally killing the TV. The room fell into eerie silence, but that didn't last long. My phone buzzed on the table and I jumped at the sound. When I picked it up, my heart sank. It was a notification, a message, from an unknown number. The message read, "You shouldn't have watched." My heart pounded, and before I could react, another message came in, this time with an attachment. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. It was a short video clip of my living room, from behind me. The angle was perfect, as if someone had been standing in the shadows the whole time I watched the episode. I dropped my phone, panic seizing my chest. I scrambled to turn on the lights, trying to convince myself this was some sick prank, but I knew better. I could feel it, the presence in the room. Something was there with me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't dare turn on the TV again either. But the worst part? Every now and then I still get those messages, always from an unknown number. Sometimes it's just static, other times it's a photo of me sitting on the couch with the TV off, and sometimes, in the middle of the night, I swear I hear the faint sound of breathing, right behind me.
My name is Lily, and I've always struggled with my skin.
acne and dry patches plagued me throughout high school and college. When I found an online ad for a face wash promising miraculous results, I had to try it. It boasted glowing reviews and pictures of perfect skin. I placed the order, desperate for a solution. The bottle arrived a few days later, sleek and clinical, Purify, Ultimate Skin Cleanser. Excited, I followed the instructions: apply to damp skin, massage, and rinse. It felt cool and tingly, and I assumed the scent was just the formula working. The next morning, my face felt unbearably itchy. Rushing to the mirror, I gasped at my reflection. My skin was bright red and raw, peeling away to expose inflamed flesh beneath. Cold water stung like fire. I checked the bottle again, no warnings, just a vanished website. For days, I hid in my apartment, applying creams, but nothing eased the pain or redness. I noticed the skin peeling away revealed a gray, lifeless color. Desperate, I visited a dermatologist. Her shocked expression deepened my fear. "The tissue is necrotic," she said. "It's like the skin is dying." Leaving her office with no answers, the gray patches spread, and my skin burned more. One night, I examined the bottle closely. Tiny letters at the bottom read, "For external use only. May result in tissue damage. Not approved for sale." My blood ran cold. I searched for the company again, nothing. The next morning, I woke to find my face almost unrecognizable. Large sections had peeled away, revealing the horrible gray tissue beneath. It felt synthetic. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the bottle in the trash, but a sharp pain shot through my face. I looked in the mirror and screamed. My face was melting. The gray patches spread like acid, distorting my features. As I tried to claw it off, it spread to my hands, sloughing off in chunks. Backing away from the mirror, I noticed movement. The bottle sat in the trash, cap twisting open on its own. A thick black liquid oozed out, bubbling as it hit the air. It wasn't just a face wash, it was something alive. Suddenly, I felt a sting on my neck. My fingers came away with that gray residue, and the flesh began to peel away. I realized, too late, this wasn't a face wash, it was something sinister, designed to devour. Now, it's spreading. If you see Purify advertised online, don't buy it. Don't even click the link. Once it gets under your skin, it doesn't stop.
My name is Ethan, and I've always been an avid gamer. I grew up playing on every console I could get my hands on, but nothing excited me more than the latest portable console release, the NextPlay. With its sleek design and promise of immersive gaming experiences, I had to have it. After saving for months, I finally got my hands on one. It was perfect, lightweight, compact, and it came preloaded with hundreds of games. I spent countless hours playing, diving into virtual worlds filled with adventure and challenges. One night, while exploring a particularly dark and eerie horror game, I noticed something strange. The character on the screen began to glitch and distort, moving in unnatural ways. I shrugged it off as a bug. After all, it was a new console. But as I continued playing, the glitches grew worse. My character stumbled through the darkened corridors of the game, the atmosphere thick with tension. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and I heard a whisper emanating from the console. "Help me," it said, the voice warped and echoing. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Had I really just heard that? I paused the game, but the whisper grew louder, now desperate and pleading. "Help me, before it's too late." Panic gripped me, but my curiosity got the better of me. I unpaused the game, and the character now appeared in a dark room filled with distorted images of faces. They were all twisted in agony, their mouths moving silently, as if trying to scream. My heart raced as I pressed on, desperate to uncover what was happening. The further I went, the more I felt a connection to the game. It was like I was stepping into the nightmares of those trapped within it. Each level I completed brought me deeper into the horror, revealing a backstory of a developer who had mysteriously vanished, leaving behind a cursed game that claimed the souls of its players. With every victory, I felt my energy waning. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with despair. "You're one of us now," they cried. Join us. The screen flickered again, and I found myself in a final showdown against a monstrous entity, a shadowy figure that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. As I fought, I realized the figure mirrored my own movements. It was as if the game was trying to pull me in, to trap me within its virtual grasp. Desperate, I fought harder, my fingers flying across the buttons. But the creature only grew stronger, feeding off my fear. I could feel its cold presence creeping into my mind, the whispers morphing into agonizing screams. Help us! Save us! I knew I had to escape. In a final act of defiance, I threw the console across the room, hoping to break its hold on me. It smashed against the wall, the screen shattering into 1,000 pieces. But the moment it hit the floor, the whispers stopped. I felt a strange calm wash over me. Relieved, I took a deep breath. It was over, or so I thought. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft beep coming from the corner of my room. I opened my eyes, heart racing, and saw the Next Play console glowing softly, untouched and intact, as if it had never been broken. The screen flickered to life, and I saw my character standing there, staring directly at me. Help us, it whispered, and I realized with horror that the game wasn't finished. The next day, I packed the console away and tried to forget. But no matter how hard I tried, I could still hear the whispers in the back of my mind. If you ever come across a Next Play console, don't buy it. Don't even touch it, because once you turn it on, it never truly lets you go.
My name is Sarah, and I've always found comfort in my favorite blanket. It was a patchwork quilt passed down through generations in my family. Each square told a story, some vibrant, others faded and frayed. When I was wrapped in it, I felt safe, cocooned in warmth. But that changed one fateful night. It was a stormy evening when I decided to curl up on the couch with my blanket. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, while the rain lashed against the roof. I flipped through channels, searching for something to watch, when I stumbled upon an old horror movie. I knew I shouldn't watch it. I was already feeling uneasy from the storm, but the flickering images drew me in. As the movie progressed, I became increasingly anxious. The tension on screen matched the storm raging outside, and I could feel the blanket tightening around me as if it were alive. I brushed it off, blaming my imagination. Just as the movie reached its climax, a loud crack of thunder shook the house. I jumped, spilling my popcorn everywhere. The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I felt something cold brush against my leg. My heart raced as I peered into the shadows. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, pulling the blanket tighter. But when the lights flickered back on, I noticed something odd. The blanket appeared to be moving on its own, the edges shifting as if something were beneath it. Panic set in. I threw the blanket off, revealing nothing but the couch beneath. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But as I settled back down, the feeling of dread loomed over me. The movie's climax left me breathless, and I decided to turn it off. But as I reached for the remote, I felt a tug on the blanket. I yanked it back, confused. Was I imagining things again? I glanced around the room, but I was alone. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, a child's voice calling from beneath the blanket. "Help me," it pleaded, soft yet chilling. I froze, heart pounding, unable to move. Was it part of the movie? Or was there something truly sinister happening? Summoning every ounce of courage, I pulled back the blanket again, fully expecting to see some twisted prank. But this time, it felt heavier, almost alive. As I lifted it, the whisper turned into a wail. "Help me! I can't breathe!" My stomach dropped. I ripped the blanket away, and to my horror, I saw a small, shadowy figure sitting on the floor, its eyes wide and terrified. It was a little girl, her face pale and gaunt, her form flickering like a faulty television screen. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice trembling. "Help me," she begged, reaching out with thin, ghostly fingers. "I'm trapped in the blanket." My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. Was this a ghost? A figment of my imagination? The storm outside raged on, but all I could focus on was the girl's pleading eyes. I knew I had to do something. "Okay, I'll help you," I shouted, feeling a strange connection to her pain. I grabbed the blanket and threw it aside, but the girl only wailed louder. "No, you have to take me with you." "Where?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Underneath," she replied, her voice a mere whisper now. "It's safe? There?" With trembling hands, I lowered myself under the couch where the blanket had fallen. The darkness enveloped me, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me. It was almost like stepping into a different world. But as I turned to look for the girl, the warmth faded, replaced by an icy chill. I felt the blanket draped over me again, heavier than before, and the whispers returned, now filled with laughter. "Join us," they sang, a chorus of childlike voices echoing around me. I realized far too late that I had stepped into a trap. The blanket was not a comforting shield. It was a gateway to something far more sinister. If you ever find a blanket that feels alive, don't wrap yourself in it, because once you do, you may never find your way out again. Let me know if you need any adjustments or additional prompts.
My name is Mark, and I've always loved hiking in the countryside. The fresh air and towering trees were my escape from the bustling city. One crisp autumn morning, I decided to explore a new trail deep in the woods. As I set off, the sun filtered through the branches, casting shadows on the ground. Hours passed, but soon the path became less defined, and an unsettling silence enveloped me. The birds had fallen silent, and the rustling leaves ceased. I paused, glancing around. The air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Pressing on, I noticed strange markings on the trees, faded symbols that seemed like warnings. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I pulled out my phone to take pictures. Just then, a sharp crack echoed behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing. Feeling uneasy, I decided to turn back. As I retraced my steps, the sun dipped lower, casting eerie shadows across the path. Then, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, calling my name. Mark. I froze, scanning the area. The whispers grew louder. Mark, help us, panic surged through me. I quickened my pace, desperate to escape the unsettling presence. The whispers morphed into frantic cries, pleading for help. I stumbled through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, I saw them, figures flickering in the shadows, their faces gaunt and hollow. They emerged from the trees, mouths moving in silent screams. I turned to run, but the trail had vanished, replaced by an endless expanse of trees. The woods were shifting. "Join us," the whispers urged. I sprinted, pushing past the phantoms. My heart raced as I felt their cold breath on my neck. Finally, I stumbled upon a small clearing with an ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward. I felt an overwhelming pull toward it, but the whispers turned into screams. "Help us! Save us!" Desperation clawed at my chest. I ran toward the tree, hoping it would lead me back to the trail. But the ground was littered with bones, small and unmistakably human. They were remnants of those lured here before me, trapped in the woods, forever pleading for release. I realized the truth, the whispers were warnings. The forest fed on souls, and I was now one of them. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned to run again, but the trees closed in around me. The familiar path was gone, replaced by darkness. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of wails. I sprinted through the trees, but the shadows reached for me, clawing at my clothes. I felt the grip of the forest wrapping around me. The last thing I remember was a blinding flash of light as I fell into darkness. If you ever hike in the countryside, remember, the woods may seem inviting, but they hide secrets darker than you can imagine. And once you hear the whispers calling your name, it may be too late to turn back.
My name is Grace, and I've always loved the open road. On a solo trip, I found myself driving late into the night, the dark highway illuminated only by my headlights. Suddenly, I spotted a flickering neon sign up ahead, at the last stop bar, Ear. Feeling thirsty, I pulled into the gravel parking lot. The bar looked worn down, with peeling paint and a buzzing sign. Despite its shabby appearance, an urge compelled me to go inside. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The smell of stale beer and fried food hung heavily in the air. A handful of patrons sat at the bar, their faces shrouded in shadows. I chose a seat at the far end, and the bartender, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, approached me. "What'll it be?" he asked, wiping a glass with a rag that looked more like a dish rag than a cleaning cloth. "A beer, please." I glanced around. The patrons were silent, their eyes fixated on me. A chill crept down my spine. As I sipped my drink, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The television flickered with static, and the atmosphere grew tense. I overheard snippets of conversation from the patrons. "A lost, or a never leave, ere under the highway, ere." Curiosity piqued. I asked the bartender about the bar's history. He hesitated, glancing at the patrons before responding. "This place has been here for decades. Travelers come and go, but some never leave, ere." I laughed nervously. "You mean they just stay here forever? E." He didn't answer, his gaze drifting toward the entrance. I turned to follow his line of sight and froze. A thick fog rolled in, obscuring the parking lot. The patrons shifted uncomfortably, their eyes widening in fear. Suddenly, the door burst open, and a disheveled figure stumbled inside. "Help me!" he shouted. "They're coming for me." E. Before anyone could react, the door slammed shut. The bartender's expression darkened. "You shouldn't have come back." E. The room fell silent as the figure backed away, panic in his eyes. Without warning, the lights went out, plunging the bar into darkness. I heard shuffling and muffled whispers, and dread thickened in the air. When the lights flickered back on, chaos erupted. The figure was gone, and the patrons now stood, their faces twisted in anguish. The bartender smirked. "They never leave," he repeated. I bolted from my seat, instincts screaming to run. As I reached the door, it wouldn't budge. I turned back, my heart pounding as the patrons advanced, their eyes hollow. "Help us, Grace," they chanted in unison. In a final act of desperation, I threw my weight against the door, and it burst open. I stumbled into the fog, gasping for breath. I jumped into my car and sped away, the neon sign disappearing behind me. I never looked back, but I knew the truth. The highway holds secrets, and some places are better left unexplored. If you ever see that flickering sign, don't stop. Just keep driving. Because once you enter, it might be your last stop.
My name is Jake, and I've been a sport biker for as long as I can remember. One Saturday, I decided to take a solo ride through the winding back roads, hoping to push my limits. As I sped along the rural highways, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow over the landscape. Suddenly, dark clouds gathered overhead. Ignoring the warning, I pushed my bike harder, the engine roaring in response. Then, the sky opened up, and heavy rain poured down. I searched for shelter and spotted an old, abandoned gas station just off the road. I parked my bike and dashed inside, relieved to escape the downpour. The interior was dim and dusty, filled with old gas pumps and broken glass. A flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting strange shadows on the walls. I thought I'd wait out the storm, but a chill ran down my spine as I noticed a motorcycle parked in the corner, its chrome gleaming ominously. Approaching it, I saw a strange insignia etched into the frame, a skull with fiery eyes. Suddenly, a tall man in black leather emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by a helmet. "Nice bike," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Care for a race?" Adrenaline surged through me. "Sure, why not?" I replied, eager to test my skills against a stranger. We mounted our bikes and sped out of the gas station, the world blurring around us. The thrill of the race was intoxicating. I pushed my bike to its limits, but when I glanced back, my heart dropped. The man in black was right on my tail, moving unnaturally fast. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't shake him off. I veered onto a side road, hoping to lose him, but he followed with eerie persistence. The terrain became more desolate, twisted shadows looming over the road. "Faster, Jake," he taunted, his voice echoing in my mind. I pushed my bike harder, but the road twisted sharply ahead. I swerved to avoid the turn, but lost control. In an instant, I crashed and tumbled onto the asphalt, pain shooting through my body. When I opened my eyes, the man in black stood over me, his expression unchanged. "You wanted speed, Jake. Now you've got it." Before I could react, he leaned closer, and the world began to fade. I felt a strange sensation pulling me away. I glanced down, horrified to see my body lying on the ground. I was trapped in limbo, a restless spirit tied to the road, forever racing against the darkness. The man in black mounted his bike and sped off into the night, leaving me behind with the haunting realization that I would never escape. If you ever find yourself on a lonely back road and see a gas station with an eerie glow, think twice before you stop. You never know who, or what, might be waiting for you.